Welcome, everyone. You are tuning in to a very special Christmas Eve live stream today. This is Danny Haifong, your host. And before we get into the content, I'm just going to spend a minute to let you know that this is a special live stream, not only in the sense that we are going to be here for a while with many incredible guests who have been covering West Asia, speaking out about genocide in Gaza, doing the real investigatory work, not only on the ground, but also day to day, speaking about the resistance and the realities. This is going to be a very great show. So please do hit the like button as you come on. Please do hit the subscribe button if you're new. Of course, this is also Christmas. It's a time for giving. So I have actually took the liberty, all of our guests have places where you can support their work. They are all in the video description, and we're going to talk about those as we go along today, as well as media outlets like Electronic Intifada, Mint Press News, and more you can find in the video description. So you support them because we need to support independent media covering all of this. Without further ado, let us get started. Israel is bombing Gaza. Israel has been bombing Yemen. Israel has been bombing Syria. And of course, Israel spent months bombing Lebanon before the recent so-called ceasefire it has violated more than 100 times. Now, with Syria's fall, the pro-Zionist forces worldwide are celebrating this as an assumed position of strength of the Israeli regime. Israel is even talking about striking Iran again. But is Israel truly winning? Or is the collapse of Syria merely a temporary reprieve, or worse, a false sense of relief amid a forever war on multiple fronts that has no end in sight? With me now to discuss this as our first guest today is Professor Mohammad Marandi. He is a professor at the University of Tehran. Thank you, Professor Marandi, for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great. Well, let us get right to it, Professor Marandi. I wanted to actually begin with this question of the state of the axis of resistance in the context of some pretty big developments. The first is Yemen. Ansarallah just announced another set of hypersonic ballistic missile strikes, its Palestine 2 missile, into Tel Aviv, injuring 20 Israeli settlers in that city. There's also been talk and claims from the Yemeni armed forces of Ansarallah that they have also downed a U.S. F-18 fighter jet, which was attempting to conduct another round of bombing against the Ansarallah movement. Professor Marandi, I wanted to ask you, what is the state of the axis of resistance now? Because after the fall of Syria, there was a lot of doom and gloom. But I wanted to ask, given this strike from Ansarallah, what can we say about the axis of resistance and where it is?
It's quite clear that the Israeli regime has scored success in Syria. It is a victory of sorts for the regime. There's no doubt about that. And we have Biden and Erdogan to thank for this success. And I know that some are celebrating what happened in Syria, but I think it's quite clear that the side that won the most by far is the Israeli regime. And I don't think we need to go into much detail about that. But that was the objective all along. The dirty war in Syria began in 2011 with the support of terrorist groups and terrorists from across the world in order to bring down Syria to strengthen the Israeli regime. That was the objective from day one. And although they failed in many ways, they failed to take Lebanon and they failed to take Iraq. But ultimately, after 13 years, Syria did fall to Al-Qaeda. But I think already people are beginning to see things differently. Those who I think were more naive, or those who still believe that the fall of Syria was it's better to have the Israelis celebrating and to have the Syrian government fall. Those who think that the Israeli celebrations are worth it, I think gradually many are beginning to see the reality. They saw how the regime and the Americans began a huge wave of bombings across the country that continue, and the destruction of the country's military and much of the country's critical infrastructure, the occupation of territory, key key mountains and water resources for Syria by the Israeli regime, and the fact that Erdogan and Giuliani have done nothing about it raises a lot of questions. And the abuse that minorities, Christians especially, as the we've some of us have seen the footage. This is beginning to things are beginning to become clearer for those who are, I think, those who've been deceived. But in any case, it is a victory for the Israeli regime. I don't think it's necessary to hide that. But I don't. But I'm not quite sure if it's a long-term victory, because the fall of Syria will have implications across the region, and the countries that are most vulnerable to these extremist groups are, ironically, almost exclusively in the American camp. So, there's no doubt that Saudi Arabia is very uncomfortable about the current situation. There's no doubt that Jordan and Egypt are uncomfortable. In fact, last night apparently, the so-called revolutionaries in Syria, these Al Qaeda militants and their allies, they were spreading footage of unrest in Egypt, old footage, and pretending as if this was happening. It was happening last night, and some say it was because they were trying to hide the protests that were taking place in Syria. But that aside, the very fact that they are targeting Egypt and putting up old footage of unrest in Egypt, means that these Al Qaeda militants have objectives that go far beyond the borders of Syria. And at the same time, they have huge challenges in Syria. Syrians are uncomfortable, especially about the foreign fighters. And the minorities, which combined constitute half of the country, are all concerned. The Kurds, the Christians, the Alawites, the Shia, the Druze, and many Sunnis, educated class, and people across of all walks of life, they are concerned. So they already have problems. They have there's fighting going on in the areas controlled by the Americans and the Kurds, and or their Kurdish proxies. And Turkey and Qatar have to fund Al Qaeda. The financial burden is on their shoulders. Until now, Iran was sending 60, on average, 60 to 70,000 barrels of oil a day to Syria. Iraq was sending 120,000 barrels of oil a day. The Russians were sending the equivalent of 50 or 60,000 barrels of oil. The Russians were sending refined different fuels, which is even more costly for them. And then, of course, the grain that the Russians were sending, the other support, medicine, and hospital equipment that the Iranians were sending in as aid, that has discontinued. So this huge financial burden for Iran, for Iraq, and for the Russians has ended, and now the burden will be on the Turkish government to deal with a country that is in ruins, thanks to the dirty war that Mr. Erdogan helped initiate along with the West and others. So Syria may face changes in the future. It's not clear what will happen, who will control the country. And at the same time, as I said earlier, countries in the American camp are vulnerable, or countries that are seen as being a part of the American camp. They're vulnerable. But this may not end well for the Americans. And if it doesn't end well for the Americans, it definitely doesn't end well for the Israeli regime. And we have to keep in mind that the United States is very busy in Europe. The war is not going well, and the Russians are making rapid advances in Ukraine, and it doesn't seem like Trump is going to be able to end the war on day one, as he promised to do. And the Americans are facing challenges with China, with Panama, and with Canada and Mexico, and all sorts of problems at home. So I don't think it's very smart for the Israeli regime to be celebrating too much. But the reality is that Netanyahu's celebrations are basically so that he could remain in power. Otherwise, I believe that what Netanyahu has done over the last year has delegitimized the Israeli regime in the eyes of the international community. It's shown it to become very weak. Just over the past day, a number of Israeli troops were killed in Gaza, and Yemen has struck again, as you pointed out. And in Lebanon, things are sensitive, very uncertain. The Israeli regime yesterday used a drone to kill 2 ordinary citizens in southern Lebanon. They are constantly violating the ceasefire, as you pointed out, but it just shows that the regime is in trouble, and the Iranians will ultimately punish the Israeli regime. And as I said before, the Iranians are not going to let the Israeli regime to get away with its airstrike on Iran.
Well, it's interesting in this moment. There have been so many more doubters about that now that Syria has fallen. But before we get to that, Professor Marandi, please talk about, if you could, your reaction to Ansar Allah's announcement that it had down the F-18 fighter jet, which was said to have been downed by friendly fire of the U.S.'s own making, because right now the U.S. and the Israeli regimes are conducting an all-out war, or attempting to conduct an all-out war against Yemen as a retaliation to their successful strikes into Tel Aviv. Could you talk about this and its significance? Because, as you said, with Syria, there was this kind of reprieve and an obvious victory for Israel, regardless of how involved it was or not in it. Now we see that the resistance isn't maybe as dead as a lot of people assumed it was after the fall of Syria.
No, and I think that the Israeli advance inside Syria and the strikes against the country, even though they've devastated excuse me, they've devastated the infrastructure, I don't think it's going to be good for the regime. It's not a smart move because it's only humiliating Jolani, it's humiliating Al Qaeda because of their indifference, it's humiliating Erdogan, who pretends to support Palestine yet has never done anything and continues to send oil to Netanyahu, cheap Baku oil to Netanyahu to help him run his genocide and continue his genocide. So I don't think it's a smart move by the regime. If I was, God forbid, a Zionist leader, I would not have advanced into Syria. I would have not have carried out all these heavy airstrikes. But of course, Netanyahu is trying to keep the public on his side, and so he does it and looks strong, and that makes him more popular inside Israel. But what it does is that it 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 exposes the regime further, and it causes problems for the people that the Israeli regime helped bring to power in Syria. Yemen, I think I didn't actually read the statement put out by the Yemeni armed forces, but my understanding is that it sort of implied that they fired the drones and missiles at the U.S. warships in a manner to create confusion, and that the Americans downed their own jet. I may be interpreting it wrong. I haven't read the statement myself, and I should have. But whether the Yemeni armed forces downed it or the Americans downed this jet that costs over $100 million each, uh, it really doesn't matter. It just shows it shows the incompetence of the U.S. military, and it shows how difficult it is to deal with Yemen. And it also shows that no matter how much the United States bombs Yemen and murders citizens, which they've done repeatedly, Yemen continues to strike the Israeli regime. It continues to strike ships that break the siege on the Israeli regime, a siege that was put in place as since the Yemeni government, Ansarullah, said that they are implementing the Genocide Convention. And they said that as long as the genocide in Gaza is taking place, the siege will continue. So the Americans have failed in breaking the siege to help the Israelis carry out genocide more easily. That is extraordinary. It shows the resilience of the resistance. Hezbollah is very much intact, very much prepared in case the war goes on. And yes, there are people who've questioned Iran, but as I said before the previous Iranian strike, it is inevitable, and this is also inevitable. The Iranians have calculations to make, especially after the fall of Syria. They have to prepare their air defenses. They have to prepare air defenses in case the Americans do anything foolish. And they also have to prepare their missiles and drones for the Persian Gulf in case the Americans do anything foolish. Because if the Americans enter the fight, the Iranians will have to strike back, and all those tiny countries in the Persian Gulf that have American bases, that would, that would all, of course, lead to the end of oil and gas production in the Persian Gulf, which will lead to a global economic meltdown. But Iran has to prepare itself for all consequences. It has to prepare itself for some stupidity on behalf of the Americans. It has to prepare itself for aggression, another active aggression by the Israeli regime. So its offensive and defensive capabilities are being prepared for any circumstances. And so those who are criticizing Iran, I think they don't recognize the fact that if conflict starts, it can get very messy, and the Iranians have to be prepared for it. And I think that the fact that it's only Iran that's supporting the resistance, it's Iran that's supporting Yemen or Hezbollah or the resistance in Iraq or Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and it was Iran alongside the Russians for the most part that were preventing ISIS and Al Qaeda from planting the black flags on Damascus. I think people should take that into consideration, that Iran is doing the heavy lifting. Emotional responses are not going to help, and I think that we have to see everything and in an objective manner.
Well, both Israel and the United States, deep inside of their military establishments, have already made note about Yemen alone, Professor Marandi. They've said that this is not an enemy that they say, quote, can be easily deterred, end quote. That is nothing like they have fought before. Ansarullah is considered a relatively small movement in the global picture, at least from the eyes of the arrogant American empire and its allies, though, Professor Marandi. So, what do you make of these comments in light of the fact that we are in a period where many people are questioning the resolve and resilience of the axis of resistance?
Well, Yemen has showed itself to be extraordinarily resilient, and it is very crucially located. And the terrain is very good for defense capabilities. And Yemen has become the Ansarullah, or what the Americans and the Europeans call the Houthis. They've become heroes across the world, and their resilience will be remembered. And the same is true with Hezbollah, which prevented the Israelis from making any inroads whatsoever. And I think we have to sort of go back and look at what happened in Ukraine for a moment. The Western media, all of them were saying that Russia lost the war, that the ruble, Biden said the ruble will be turned into rubble. And we've been hearing that the Russians are losing the war for almost 3 years now. Yet today, all of a sudden, over the last, I don't know, a couple of months maybe, we've seen this sudden shift in the Western media. And suddenly there's an acknowledgement that things are not going well in Yemen, in Ukraine. So, 3 years of Russian in Iran, I would have discussions at with colleagues in think tanks, and many believe that the Russians were losing because, unfortunately, many Iranian elites they read the Washington Post and the New York Times and watch CNN and read Western think tank material, and they don't seek alternative sources so that they could put everything together. And many of them were misled, and they believed that the Russians were losing the war. And people like myself and others were saying that this is misleading, this is propaganda, and we had a very difficult time convincing colleagues, and we failed to do so. At least I failed to do so in many cases. But suddenly, all of these friends of mine are now seeing the reality being very different from what they're being told. So I wouldn't take anything that Netanyahu or the New York Times or the Washington Post, what they say, very seriously. We saw, for example, 60 Minutes gloating over the pager explosions, which killed innocent people, which blinded children. I put up some pictures of them on my Twitter feed today, which blinded a mother. This is, I wouldn't take 60 Minutes or ABC or NBC or CBS or BBC Sky News seriously. And I think those who support the resistance should remain very resilient, and they should never feel demoralized or depressed. The struggle has ups and downs, and in Iran, we've learned to be patient. You probably know that in Iran, in Iranian culture, the story of the grandson of the Prophet in Karbala is something that Iranians feel very close to, and how he stood against the despot of his era to support the people, and he said no to humiliation. And then when he and his companions were all murdered, they took his sister to the representative of the despot, and he said, how do you see things now? How do you feel? He was trying to humiliate her, and she said, I saw nothing but beauty. In other words, their martyrdom, their resistance was beauty in a sense, because resistance is something, legitimate resistance for a greater cause is something beautiful. So the horror of Gaza is something that pains us every day, but the fact that so many people, the axis of resistance, are sacrificing for the people of Gaza is something very beautiful indeed. So we have to have patience. We have to keep active. We have to remain active. We have to wake people up. And we see that the Western media has put aside Gaza completely for obvious reasons. So of Western regimes, we have to make sure we're reminding people day and night that the Holocaust continues in order to further destroy the regime and to humiliate those who support the regime. So I do not share the pessimism of some, and I think that we have to all learn to have more patience. And we really don't have time to be dejected. We have too many. All of us have too many things to do.
Indeed, and it's so interesting, this combination of the need, the imperative as a matter of principle to maintain a steadfast, disciplined, and commitment to solidarity with Palestinians and, of course, the rest of the region under increasing aggression from the U.S., Israeli, Turkish, etc. Regimes of the dying Western order. But there's also this objective reality, Professor Marandi. I feel like a lot of people are neglecting to mention now after the fall of Syria. I've had you on the show before, and I talked about the Council of Foreign Relations being very concerned about Israel having to take on a long war, emphasis on long here, a long war on about 8 fronts, and was urging Israel to pull back, to take it one front at a time. Now, we have more information. A lot of these people who are questioning Iran, I look at Israeli media from time to time, and even just in the last few days, you have the North and Military Affairs correspondent of Maariv, this is an Israeli media, Avi Ashkenazi, who said that, quote, Iran remains a major power with hundreds of thousands of missiles, an economy much larger than Israel's, and vast resources, including minerals and gas and oil. He also said that he doubted Israel being capable of engaging a war of attrition with Iran. Professor Marandi, what do you make of these comments?
Yes, without a doubt, if there is an exchange between the Iranians and the Israeli regime, the Iranians would hit them very hard, and they can fire wave after wave of missiles and drones. And that's not including the hundreds of thousands of missiles and drones that are pointed at the Persian Gulf, which are shorter and medium range missiles that can reach their destination in just a few minutes. And then you have the Iranian Navy, the Iranian Air Force, and the Persian Gulf is not very wide, and it's long, and Iran owns one side of the Persian Gulf. That's why it's called the Persian Gulf. And so everywhere in the Persian Gulf is easily accessible. And Iran has many underground drone and missile bases across the country. They've been preparing themselves for American aggression for decades. And so all of Iran's key assets are deep underground. And therefore, Iran can easily uh, uh, destroy everything that the Israeli regime has, all of its infrastructure in any exchange. And it has created a balance of terror with the United States. So the Americans know that a strike on Iran would lead to a global economic meltdown, which would have huge consequences for the world. It would lead to mass migration and refugees everywhere because the economies would collapse everywhere. So Iran has that capability, and Iran will show the Israeli regime a bit of that capability when the time comes. One thing that I wanted to add is that I think it's very important that how this, and this is unrelated sort of, but how the Israeli regime really doesn't care about the West. They don't care about their allies. They want a regional war because they want the Americans to get involved. They don't care if the global economy goes down. They don't care if the Americans, uh, their economy is wrecked and their armed forces take high casualties in the Persian Gulf or in Iraq or in the Caucasus. They don't care because they only care about themselves, just like the pager attacks. For me, the pager attacks signal mean that we should no longer purchase any electronic goods that are produced by Western companies or that are produced in countries that are in the Western camp because they're no longer safe. None of them are safe. They can be weaponized against us in different ways. So the Israelis don't care about Western brands. They don't care about the credibility of Western companies and corporations and the needs of Western people and Western workers. They only care about themselves. So they'll weaponize products produced by companies for their own selfish interests and, of course, murder innocent people, but they don't care about the consequences that they will have for these companies and for these countries and for the workers and ordinary citizens in countries that are actually supporting the Israeli regime. So it just shows how, this genocidal regime is so, it's not only completely racist, it considers people in our part of the world as all Amalek, but it's racist towards everyone and considers, everyone to be its inferior and worthy of being sacrificed for their own selfish interests.
So, Professor Marandi, what would you say to people? Because one of the narratives I see when we talk about Iran, we talk about Israel, we talk about the axis of resistance, is the fact that Iran has not conducted Operation True Promise 3. A lot of people are asking why when they saw Syria fell. A lot of people were saying it was a mistake not to do so. And given that you said that Iran has the capabilities to essentially wipe out Israel's capabilities, some might ask, why not? Why haven't they done so yet? Professor Marandi, how do you see this?
Well, I explained that a bit. First of all, if Iran, if Iran struck back, and if True Promise 3 was carried out, let's say a month ago, it wouldn't have had any impact on Syria. The situation in Syria is different. Syria has been brought to its knees. The West has destroyed Syria, just like they've destroyed Gaza, just like the collective West and Israel together have destroyed Gaza, and just as if they've destroyed so many cities in Lebanon and slaughtered so many people, they've massacred hundreds of thousands of people with their terrorists, with ISIS and Al Qaeda and Jaish al-Islam and other terror groups. They've destroyed the economy, thus destroying families and lives and killing people for many years. The Caesar sanctions have crushed Syria. And then they've stolen the country's oil and their agricultural heartland in the east of Syria. They steal the grain, so they make people starve in Syria. And in certain parts of Syria, they were on the verge of starvation. But they're stealing their grain and their oil and taking it elsewhere and selling part of it through Turkey to the Israelis, some of that oil. So it's not as if, what's happened to Syria is a combination of many things. Hezbollah was busy fighting in the south, so um, Erdogan used his terrorists and his foreign fighters to use that opportunity to strike. I don't think even Erdogan, I'm sure Erdogan actually know that Erdogan did not think that he would be able to take Damascus. That was not the plan. The plan was not even to take um, the north. They just wanted to expand the territory so that they could have more leverage against Damascus. I don't think they even thought that they would take Aleppo. I don't think that they believed that. They wanted to expand so that they could sit at the negotiating table. And one of the interesting things is that if Erdogan, it's interesting that President Assad is blamed for all the death and destruction, as if he was sitting there and there was no one fighting him. ISIS, Al Qaeda, Jaish al-Islam, all of them, they were coming from Istanbul, from Turkey. They were coming from Jordan, and the whole of NATO was behind them, and so were these oil and gas-rich countries in the Persian Gulf. And the very fact that they failed, despite bringing in tens of thousands of foreign fighters in previous years, showed that the ordinary people in Syria did not want these terror groups. Otherwise, how could they win against such an overwhelming force? Many people in Syria who I knew, because I would frequently go there, I'd go to the University of Damascus regularly and other universities. Many liked Assad, many disliked Assad, but no one wanted the terrorists. No one wanted them. And that's why they succeeded. But they succeeded in defending their country. But what the Americans did and the Europeans and neighbors is that they crushed the nation. So Iran's retaliation would not have changed the reality on the ground in Syria. And again, as I said, Iran's retaliation has to be very well calculated. Iran cannot just simply, bomb endlessly the Israeli regime, because the global majority, Iran wants to keep it on its side. You have to do things within a certain framework. Iran has this opportunity to strike the Israeli regime because the regime carried out an act of aggression against Iran. So Iran wants to make sure it's done well, and also it's prepared for what could possibly happen afterwards, whether in the Persian Gulf region or from Israel. And we know that the Americans are going to be involved. Even if the Americans don't directly get involved, the Americans are the ones who are refueling Israeli planes, jets over Iraq. The Americans were deeply involved. And now the Israelis can fly over Syria as well. So Iran has to make calculations about air defenses, about capabilities. They also have to prepare themselves for, for a possible American intervention. This is, it's easy. It's very easy to say, do this or do that. But Iran has to do it in a way to make sure that the other side loses, and that the resistance has success, and that the axis of genocide that they fail. And so they're going to have to be very careful in their calculations and in the way in which they conduct themselves.
That makes a lot of sense. Oftentimes, war is viewed in this kind of dichotomous, very much isolated thought process of, well, Israel is doing this in the region. Iran is strong enough to stand up definitively and decisively. So Iran must do it now. But uh, given the situation that the region finds itself in, Professor Marandi, given that there are still obvious strengths, there is no defeating resistance in totality, given that Israel still is at war on so many fronts and still has to confront these fronts from here until they are decided, which is there absolutely is no end in sight. And given that there are all of these consequences, how can we then understand the overall posture of the axis of resistance moving forward? Because right now, everybody, it seems, is writing it off.
Well, I think those who write off the resistance, again, that's wishful thinking on their behalf. And I think some of supporters of the resistance are a bit too dejected these days. I actually believe that the fall of Syria may well be a blessing in disguise. The previous regime wasn't an ideal government. Iran had problems, and so did the Russians and others. They had problems with Syria. President Assad was probably the best in the broader regime. The Ba'athist Party wasn't a good party. It did a lot of harm to society. The issue was that the terrorists, ISIS, Al Qaeda, and the others, were far, far worse. We've seen what they've done in the past. If we're to believe Western narratives, they carried out 9/11. If we're to believe Western narratives, they carried out 7/7 in London. They carried out the Manchester attack. And that's just what they did there. What they've done to our region with Western support is infinitely worse. Infinitely worse. We still remember how they would burn people alive and how they would behead people in front of the camera, or how they would put people in cages and drown them. ISIS and Al Qaeda have the same ideology. They were the same. They split over power. It was one group. They split over power. It was not about ideology. And HTS separated from Al Qaeda, not because it was against Al Qaeda. Both sides, Al Qaeda agreed that it would separate. The separation happened 8 years ago. I've tweeted the footage. When they separated, it was with the consent of Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda wanted HTS to be able to rebrand itself for the West. And during the ceremony, when Jolani was announcing the separation, he praised Osama bin Laden, and he praised the head of Al Qaeda, and he praised all the people who needed to be praised, and they were praising him. So the ideology is the same. So what was important for Iran and others was that these awful terrorists don't win. So it wasn't as if the Syrian government was some great government that was fighting for and it distanced itself from the resistance over the past few years and tilted towards Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, and it refused to cooperate with the resistance increasingly. So I don't want to blame everything on the Syrian government or President Assad, but because again the Americans destroyed the economy, and Erdogan destroyed much of the country and killed hundreds of thousands of people with his terrorists. And Abdullah in Jordan helped, and the countries in the Persian Gulf, they spent many billions of dollars to bring about the slaughter and the destruction in Syria. But I think that ultimately what is happening in Syria is not going to be good news for the United States. First of all, they've angered Russia. They've angered China, because the Chinese, on Chinese social media, people are seeing these Chinese terrorists. And in Central Asia, they're seeing these Uzbek terrorists, Tajik terrorists, and terrorists from across Central Asia. This is not going to be good for Erdogan. It's not going to be good for Turkey. I feel sorry for the Turkish people, because I've been to Turkey. I've been invited to Turkey many times. I have many friends there, even in the AK party. Those who I know, none of them agree with these policies. I'm sure many do, but those who are smart and educated and understand what's going on, they're not happy with what's happening. The people of Turkey, or Turkey, they are among the most staunch pro-Palestinian people. Many have protested against Erdogan and his trade, and his oil trade, and his political ties, and his intelligence ties with the Israeli regime. They protested and they've gone to jail. But in any case, I think that the axis of resistance is very much there. Yes, it's been harmed in Lebanon. They've taken large casualties, ordinary people in the resistance. But so have the Israelis have been weakened. And by the way, the Israelis are fighting on multiple fronts, and they are growing weaker as a result. But remember, it's not Israel that's fighting. It's the collective West that's fighting. The entire West is behind this war. It's behind this genocide. Whatever they need, they'll send to the regime. So, in Beirut, Hezbollah has been fighting with 40 Western embassies, knifing them in the back with these fascist groups like the Lebanese forces, these genocidal fascist groups that are allies of Western embassies. The same people who carried out the Sabra and Shatila massacre in 1982, killing 3,500 Palestinians and Lebanese Shia in 36 hours. These are the people who are trying to undermine Hezbollah. So Hezbollah has to fight to help Gaza, and they have to watch their back as well. And so the axis of resistance has a big burden on its shoulder, and it's very much alone. Of course, there are people across the board, across the world, that are supporting the resistance and the axis of resistance. Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, people from all walks of life, no doubt about it, and they all have an impact. And hopefully, over the Christmas holiday and the New Year, people will continue to remain active. And well, I hope everyone enjoys the Christmas holiday and they have a Merry Christmas. But I'm sure everyone is going to remain active for the Palestinian people and for the people of the region, and in opposition to Zionism in the days ahead. And they won't forget them during their holiday.
Yeah. Well, I want to say one thing about Turkey, and then ask you the final question here, Professor Marandi. But there's a lot of, I believe, overestimation of Turkey's capabilities. I think people, I see a lot, especially in the collective West, especially on social media, believing that now Turkey is some historically strong empire that's going to achieve its neo-Ottoman dreams. I just don't see this. I'm in the United States. I know U.S. exceptionalism quite well. I know the arrogance of the empire. I know what the United States is all about when it comes to its imperial projection. And I just don't see Turkey being able to project itself without permission from Washington. And with that, of course, means that Turkey will have to operate as an operative of Washington. And I just don't believe that Turkey is going to find as much benefit from all of this, as similar to what you're saying. But Professor Marandi, my one final question to you that I want to kind of get into deeply over the next 15 minutes or so is this. You know, we can't forget about Gaza. There's fierce fighting in Jabalia, all up and down the Gaza Strip between Israeli forces and the Palestinian resistance. You've been mentioning Hezbollah is still intact. There's a lot of talk about Hezbollah's weapons being all destroyed in Syria, that Hezbollah is now completely cut off. But in my estimation, Hezbollah is more powerful than it has been over the 4 decades of its existence about. And lastly, Professor Marandi, I wanted to ask you just overall, given this situation, given the situation Iran is in, after the fall of Syria, we see a lot of talk about Hezbollah being isolated and weak and in danger, Iran being in danger of regime change next, Palestinians completely isolated and abandoned. How would you assess these narratives now that we are entering 2025?
Well, first I should say that Turkey or Turkey is a very important country. It's a very influential country. It has a strong Sufi tradition, which makes it very similar to Iran. If you travel from Iran to Turkey or travel from Turkey to Iran, you'll feel very comfortable because the culture is very similar, uh, strikingly similar. But here we're talking about Erdogan and how Erdogan, after I think a decade of success, after 2011, I think gradually he's become a problem for Turkey or Turkey. I think the first decade of his rule was on you know you could call it a success, but I think ever since what happened in Syria in 2011, that it's gone downhill, and he's taking Turkey in the wrong direction. He under Erdogan, Turkey now has, I think, $500 billion of foreign debt, and that's why the Americans can easily put pressure on him. You're absolutely correct. If you recall, a few years back, it was under Trump actually, when he arrested a pastor who he claimed had been involved in the coup. Trump threatened sanctions, and the Turkish economy immediately took a big hit, and Erdogan had to kneel and hand over uh, the uh, the pastor. I don't know if the pastor was guilty or not. I'm not that much familiar with the case, but the point is that he had to bend the knee. So under Erdogan, Turkey is definitely vulnerable. It's not, and it's also vulnerable to extremism. Actually, Turkey, which is the Sufist culture, uh, is my as my experience of Turkey is that Turkey did not have in 2011-12 a Salafist culture. These extremists did not have a cultural foothold in Turkey, but that has changed to a degree, and that's something that many of my Turkish friends are concerned about. So, and now with what's happened in Syria, I think that the challenges for Turkey are going to increase. But in any case, while I don't want to say that Syria was not a win for Netanyahu, it was, but in some ways it helps Hezbollah. For Hezbollah, Syria was a burden. They had to have troops there to help the Syrians against Al Qaeda and ISIS. Now they can focus on Lebanon. The Iranians too. The Iranians have spent, I think, about um, uh, they were sending almost 2 million barrels of oil a month to Syria alongside its other aid. It doesn't have to do that now. It can spend that money for other things. Uh, the same is true with Iraq. The same is true with the Russians. And the burden now for this broken country is on those countries that have been supporting these terrorists all these years. And so it's going to be a challenge for them. And I don't think it's going to be an easy ride. And I think Mr. Erdogan has made a major, major miscalculation. Again, he did not think he's going to own Syria. He thought he's going to take a bit of territory and then put it on the table in order to get concessions from Assad. But things moved in a very different direction. But in any case, when the resistance is very much intact, and the resistance will continue to fight for the Palestinian people, as we've seen. But as human beings, we are all responsible to help the people of Palestine. It doesn't matter if the resistance, the axis of resistance is winning or not. As human beings, we have a responsibility. And it is the number one issue in the world today. And so uh, it doesn't matter. I'm confident about the future of the resistance. And I never believed that the Israeli regime was going to collapse anytime soon. I believe that it is the beginning of the end of the regime. And I don't think it's going to last very long. But I never thought it was going to collapse over the next, over the last few months or over the next few months. That I think has never been something that anyone uh, remotely imagined. I'm not saying it's impossible, but that's not how it ever seemed to be. But the most important thing of all is to delegitimize the regime. The regime has been weakened militarily, its economy has been crashed. In future, people should refrain from, we should push people to keep the regime isolated, and we should isolate those companies and governments that help the regime. That's why, I think products produced in NATO countries as much as possible shouldn't be purchased, even by people living inside these countries. But our responsibility is to make sure that people are increasingly aware about the illegitimate nature of the regime, the genocidal nature of the regime, so that Israelis, wherever they travel in the world, they are not welcome. And that, I think, will have an impact. And I think some Israelis will feel they're uncomfortable about being Israeli when they travel. They'll be embarrassed about their passport. And that is something that I think is going to have an impact in the future. But in any case, even if God forbid the resistance fails, and I by no means believe that will happen. But even if the resistance fails, our responsibility is to defend the oppressed. It is to, again, I'm perhaps as a Shia Muslim, I'm very much influenced by Karbala and Ashura and the martyrdom of Imam Hussein and his sister Hazrat Zainab, Sayyidina Zainab. Uh, that's part of it. But whether we win or lose, whether we succeed or fail, what is important is that we carry out our responsibilities. And if we carry out our responsibilities, we can live with ourselves because we do the right thing. If we don't, it doesn't matter. Even if we succeed, even if the resistance succeeds and the Israelis collapse, if the regime collapses, but we don't do our duty, we don't carry our burden, then we failed. So even if Palestine succeeds, there's a chance that we fail. So we have to do what we have to do, all of us. And again, we don't have time. Sometimes I get upset. Sometimes things don't look good. Sometimes things look good. Sometimes things look, you see more, people become more optimistic. But under all those circumstances, we have to do what we have to do and plod on until, inshallah, the people of Palestine are freed and Jews, Christians, and Muslims can live side by side in Palestine. And Christians can all go on the 25th of December and celebrate Christmas in Jerusalem and in Bethlehem. And then the Orthodox Christians can go, and the Armenians can go in January and celebrate as well. And we can all live a much better and happier life. We can all live better and happier lives in the future. Yes, the capabilities of Hezbollah, of Ansarullah, of the resistance in Yemen, of course, uh, and Lebanon, they have they have huge capabilities at home. They have underground factories, they have research facilities, and they produce the weapons that they need, especially the weapons that they need for their geography and their and the sort of warfare that they're carrying out. In Iraq, they have the same, and Gaza, of course, and the West Bank. Well, I don't know much about the West Bank, but Gaza, they produce some of their own weapons. Of course, they're getting assistance from Iran. There's no doubt about it. Iran continues to send uh, financial assistance to Gaza. Of course, it's all underground and secret, but that so that it won't be exposed, so that the enemy won't be able to figure out how, it's so they won't be able to stop it. But they have their own indigenous capabilities. But when he says that we have no proxies, what he means is not that they have the capabilities to produce weapons. So that's a part of it, of course. But the real issue is that they are fighting because they believe in this struggle. Proxies are like Al Qaeda. Proxies are like all those terror groups that NATO and the terror groups that NATO and the others have been um, supporting. But these people, they are making huge sacrifices for the sake of the Palestinian people. Hezbollah could have cut a deal with the West years ago. Imagine what the West was prepared to give to Hezbollah, not to enter the fight. The same is true with Ansarullah in Yemen. The same is true with the resistance in Iraq. But all of them have a belief in resistance, just like the Jewish and Christian and Muslim and Hindu university students in the United States who pay a price for protesting, or people across the world who may pay a price for defending the Palestinian people, or who may be arrested in some countries for defending the Palestinians. None of them are proxies. They have agencies. They have agency. They believe in what they're doing, and that means that they're not. If you don't believe in what you're doing, you're a proxy. But if you believe in what you're doing, sanctions don't stop you. The Americans imposed maximum pressure sanctions on Iran because of Palestine. And they said, well, if Iran's financial capabilities are decreased, then these groups will collapse. None of them collapse. They're stronger today than they've ever been before. So the issue is not money. The issue is that these groups believe in the liberation of Palestine, and that they believe that Palestine must be a land where the Palestinian people's rights are restored, and that different religions live there side by side because the land is holy to everyone.
Yes, well said, Professor Marandi. I just quickly, I will repeat the question because I was on mute on StreamYard. You could hear me, Professor Marandi, but others couldn't. So I'm just going to repeat the question for later on and for the audience here. I asked Professor Marandi, what do you make of Ayatollah, the supreme leader's Ali Khamenei, his comments that Iran doesn't have any proxies and that the axis of resistance, whether it is Hezbollah, whether it is Yemen, whether it is the Palestinian resistance, they have their own production capabilities. With all that said, Professor Marandi, I do want to give a huge thank you to you over the year of 2024 for being so generous with your time, coming on here to enlighten us from the region, to assess all of this situation. I am very grateful for it. And so I really appreciate it. I look forward to much more in 2025.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and congratulations to all those to the east of Iran who are celebrating Christmas in Australia and over there. And it's tomorrow's Christmas, so I congratulate them for the Christmas for tomorrow. And if I'm not on your show before January the 6th or the 7th, I congratulate Orthodox Christians and Armenians and all Christians for the birth of Christ. And I hope that life improves for Christians, Muslims, Jews, and everyone, everywhere in the years ahead. These are dark days, but we have to be optimistic. We have to remain optimistic. There is definitely light at the end of the tunnel.
All right. Thanks so much, Professor Marandi. Again, we will be in touch. Have a great holiday if I don't talk to you before then. We have plenty of show, though, to go, including first-time guest Dan Cohen. He is the curator. He has a publication called Uncaptured Media, which you can go to the video description below and check out. Subscribe. We're trying to support independent media here, especially on this holiday. Dan, thanks so much for taking your Christmas Eve time here to join me.
A pleasure. Thanks very much for having me, Danny.
Yeah, of course. Of course. Well, your work has been so critical over the years covering this region in particular, Dan. And of course, there is a lot going on from the fall of Syria to everyone, at least everyone who is pessimistic about the situation in the region, declaring the axis of resistance dead. Dan, how do you see all of this? How do you tie in the investigative work you've been doing into the unfolding situation in West Asia from Gaza to Syria, Lebanon, and beyond?
Well, I think we first have to really just define what is resistance. Resistance is not about being the hegemonic force, the more well-funded, well-armed force with access to international capital. It is about resistance. It is about being basically the underdog. And so the goal or the job of the resistance is not so much to have an outright military victory, I would say, over Israel, over the United States, over the reactionary forces. It is not for. It is. I think the image that maybe people have in their minds of Hezbollah or the Quds force marching into Jerusalem and liberating the Al-Aqsa compound, while very romantic, is not quite based in reality. The reality is that, and actually, I spoke with Professor Marandi about this just after October 7th. The idea of resistance is that these movements, whether at the non-state level like Hezbollah or at the state level like Iran, defend their sovereignty, hold the imperialist forces back, and the contradictions inside Israel, for example, or the contradictions in the relationship between the United States and Israel, those are what actually lead to the demise of Israel, the collapse of the regime. And so it's absolutely a major setback what has happened in Syria, first and foremost to the Syrian people themselves, which are now ruled by an Al-Qaeda regime that not only have they lost their sovereignty, but these foreign-funded terrorist forces who have terrorized the country for more than a decade are now ruling. And not only have they lost their sovereignty, but there's no central authority in the state now. So even if, let's say, Iran or any country wanted to really negotiate with the new kind of de facto regime in Syria, al-Jolani may say, oh, I've moderated and I'm no longer part of ISIS or Al-Qaeda and we're just focused on Syria now. He can say that, and I don't really believe that. He still holds the same exact ideology, but the forces who are on the ground fighting, they are not loyal to him. They are loyal to whoever's paying him. So as long as there's money flowing in, they may do what they're told. But that's been the case throughout the entire dirty war on Syria, is that the 1,000 different armed groups that are constantly shifting, they will fight for whoever is paying them. There is zero national ideology. It is purely about money in the language of jihad and this kind of thing. So I think, I agree with Professor Marandi that it's certainly a short-term victory for Israel and for Turkey, but they've basically used a poison to destroy Syrian sovereignty, and now the entire region will now have to deal with that poison. I mean, we've seen in previous years the terrorist attacks that were in Europe. From fighters who were involved in the regime change operations in Libya, for example, and then they go back to either their home countries and to their home countries and try to destabilize those, or they go to Europe and carry out terrorist attacks and this sort of thing. So this is now a problem that has metastasized as a result of the Western imperialist desire to overthrow Syria, which has finally succeeded. However, the resistance, as I said, the idea is not to have an outright military victory in the same way that, for example, Israel would declare a military victory. It's a different standard. The whole for the resistance, let's take, for example, Hezbollah. The Lebanese people, Lebanon suffered tremendously from this latest Israeli aggression, from this war. But Israel was not able to achieve its stated goals, which is namely to stop rocket fire, to bring security and stability to the north of Israel, to the Galilee, and so the residents can return home, tens of thousands of whom had been living basically in hotels in the around Tel Aviv. That has not happened. And as long as the genocide goes on and this conflict goes on, and Israel continues to bomb and attack southern Lebanon, which despite this so-called ceasefire, it has done so, it cannot achieve its goals. The same in Gaza. It has obliterated every square meter of Gaza, but the resistance still goes on. There is not real security. There's no real stability for what they call the Gaza envelope. So, I mean, I think we have to see this in the bigger picture, in the longer term, and understand the very nature, the definition of what resistance is. And it's not as if with the fall of Syria that the resistance in Gaza has suddenly given up. Every day we see videos of operations where they're still managing to take out Israeli soldiers. That has not changed. And certainly that's the case in Lebanon too. I'm sure the resistance there is continuing to basically prepare itself for the next round, which they know is inevitable. And even with the devastating loss of Syed Hassan Nasrallah and basically the senior leadership and even some of the mid-level leadership of Hezbollah, they were still able to carry out very serious operations against Israel because it's such a horizontal organization. It's not just one guy calling all of the shots. And of course, Iran is preparing for another confrontation with Israel. So, I mean, I think we have now entered the next chapter of this basically long decline of Western imperialism with Israel as its outpost in the Middle East or West Asia. And we have to just kind of stay focused.
Well, the interesting thing you said there, Dan, about planting a poison in the region that Turkey, Israel, the United States have with the incoming HTS and all of the associated bandits now running amok inside of what was formerly the Syrian Arab Republic, is that, when you plant poison or when you spill poison, there's a risk that the spillover may come back to you, that you cannot control the flow of this poison and that you indeed become poisoned. It's one of the reasons why I don't believe Turkey can actually sustain such a neo-Ottoman dream in the current state that it is in. But my question to you, Dan, is this. Given all that you said about the contradictions that afflict the entirety of the empire, the Western Empire, how do you see then this coming period where, yes, Syria is going to be quite a challenge to navigate, and it will cause problems for the resistance. But the resistance is fighting a different kind of war, and in large part, despite the fall of Syria, has been successful in that war, resisting Israel, being able to expose through their resistance to the world exactly what is going on and who should be condemned and how this genocide needs to stop, and building strength and unity all along the way. But I wanted to ask you, given that reality, how do you see this playing out for those who are perpetrating these crimes, for Israel, for Turkey, for the United States, for this empire that is trying to coalesce around expansionism from Syria and beyond in West Asia?
Well, my sense is that there was a sort of Faustian bargain made between the regional powers that had been trying to uh, devour the Syrian Arab Republic for, well, since 2011, officially. Namely, as you said, Turkey, Israel, and of course you have Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the Western powers that have supported this dirty war. And so so I would think that al-Jolani, now known as Ahmed al-Shada, has been allowed to have his sort of sphere of influence, which is heavily backed by Turkey, and maybe he's kind of a Turkish lord in a way, and that comes with allowing Israel to have its sphere of influence in the Golan Heights in the south. And so while that may look good on paper for them, as I was saying before, the fighters on the ground who have no national ideology and have a very extreme ideology that demands killing anybody who does not conform to their beliefs. This is Al Qaeda. These are not people who want to simply stay inside the borders of Syria and impose some kind of pseudo caliphate. These are people who want to kill anybody who doesn't conform to their demented worldview. And so I would not be surprised if there are terrorist attacks in Turkey that destabilize the Turkish state. And that's a horrific thought for the innocent people of Turkey who are likely to suffer as a result of what the Turkish government of Erdogan has done. Similarly, in Qatar, countries like that. I mean, we could easily see people, these fighters will go back. The foreign fighters, of which there are many, will go back to the countries they are from. We've seen many Uyghur terrorists who are fighting in Syria and now have been offered citizenship, but they want to go back and destabilize China. And, despite the claims of Mike Pompeo that the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement no longer exists, it certainly does. And we've seen their videos from Turkey, or I'm sorry, from Syria. And so I expect that they will go back to China to try to destabilize China and carry out terrorist attacks in there, which the West will be very happy with, because that is a key part of the China's connection to Europe, to Eastern Europe, and then all the way to West Europe as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think the U.S. really, the cynical actors who are really crafting our foreign policy, will see this as some kind of positive. But if there were any sanity in Washington, which sadly there is absolutely none, then the U.S. would certainly not have done this in the first place, but would actually ally with Russia and with China and with countries who actually want stability and progress for the countries and development and mutually beneficial trade to take care of this problem in Syria. But they've done exactly just the opposite, and I think the world is now going to suffer as a result of it.
Yeah, and now maybe quickly, because I definitely want to get into your work on the atrocity propaganda, which has been so shocking given the fact that Syria actually has fallen and we've seen it ramp up to a degree that is reminiscent of 2011. Before we get to that, though, Dan, your assessment then, I asked you, what do you think the trajectory of the empire is going to be? What do you think the trajectory of the resistance will be now with the fall of Syria? Because, as I have said throughout this program, the from the perspective of outsiders, mainly, it seems like in the collective West, people who watch this show, a lot of doom and a lot of gloom. Your take?
Yeah, I think the doom and gloom is a bit of a bourgeois feeling. For those of us who are, watching from afar, and our lives are not really on the line, it's easy to sort of have just emotional swings when, after October 7th, those powerful scenes of, Israeli tanks being burned down and the walls of the ghetto being destroyed, everyone felt elated. And then with Syria, when Syria falls, people feel very down. But the key thing is to stay consistent, to be on an even keel, because this is not a short fight. This is a long battle, and we have no idea, perhaps a never-ending battle. We have no idea how this is going to go. There's so many factors at play that are completely unpredictable. The internal politics of so many countries, the internal politics here in the United States, as second Trump administration is, in a few weeks going to take the reins here in Washington, where I am. You can't overstate the internal chaos in Israeli society, which is pretty well covered up in the media, which is, something I can kind of talk about at length. But I mean, there are just so many factors that nothing is set in stone, nothing is a done deal. And at this very moment, especially for us in the media or people who are active on social media and follow your show and others, Danny, we are being subjected to massive psychological operations through the atrocity propaganda, and there's an effort to kind of create a false, distorted narrative about what's happening in Syria right now, about what's happened in Syria since 2011. And that's, I think, what we need to focus on. So, that sort of emotional discontent, to put it into something constructive, because this is not over.
Well, people get angry at me sometimes, Dan, for erring on the optimism side, but my optimism certainly isn't clouded by the reality. It is, or certainly isn't clouding the reality for me that yes, Palestinians are being slaughtered. There's a genocide. The people in Lebanon have been slaughtered. The entire region is in a catastrophic situation because of what the U.S., Israel, and its imperial apparatus is doing there. However, it is to say, though, that because the resistance has gone stronger, because even amid one of the most catastrophic, in my estimation, events of the year, the fall of Syria, there is still going to be fight back. No one is putting down their arms. We saw Yemen actually upping the ante, despite what happened in Syria. We've seen Israeli officials, Israeli media talk about Iran still having these massive capabilities that they can't figure out. So there's a lot left still on the table, and resistance is a long war. Never in history have I seen a resistance war against a colonial entity be a rapid one, but yet the result has relatively been the same. These entities do end up having to pack their bags and leave. The United States experienced this at trying to inherit the French colonial mission in Vietnam and being absolutely ousted. That took 20 years because the U.S. actually started in 54 and then ran out of there in 75. So in any event, Dan, I wanted to ask you, though, in light of all of this, people have been quite, I guess it's not in lieu, it's in light of, but in light of all of this, you've been covering this atrocity propaganda in Syria, or on Syria. What do you make of the fact, and what have you been investigating given that we are seeing the fall of Bashar al-Assad, the ouster, I believe it was a coup. I believe it was a coup. That's just what it looks like. It smells like everything we've seen. Years in the making, obviously. Now, yet the atrocity propaganda is so intense, from CNN to mass graves to prisons, all of this. Talk about what you've been covering.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I basically, I have this tendency to just go after the most sort of uncomfortable or controversial subjects, just because that's usually where the biggest lies are. And so I've spent the last 2 weeks or so burying myself in the narratives that are being pushed on the prisons in Syria, and in the last few days, the mass graves. And if you look at the claims about mass graves, in particular, there's a report from the British Channel 4 outlet, as well as a handful of others, Reuters, the Free Press, which is run by the neocon Zionist Barry Weiss, who put a target on Rifat al-Harir's back, and that clearly led to him being murdered in a massacre along with several of his family members. These outlets, first I'll say, they have, well, regarding the mass graves, they have basically resurrected a story that was planted by in the New York Times in 2022 by Moaz Mustafa, who's basically a regime change asset, who's the director of the Syrian Emergency Task Force. And this guy brought John McCain to Syria in 2013, I believe, to meet with members of the armed opposition. And there was a photo that came out of them, and they actually, those militants, turned out, had actually kidnapped several Shia pilgrims. So this guy's connected to actual terrorists. He has been kind of the guy leading this, and he's taken he back in 2022, he got this story in the New York Times that there was these alleged mass graves, one of which the evidence was an aerial photograph of a field where apparently some trenches were dug, and the other one was an actual cemetery that they were saying is a suspected mass grave. That's how the New York Times describes it. And then the only testimony they have is from 4 anonymous Syrian figures, only one of whom was in Syria, 2 of whom were in Germany, one of which was in Lebanon. So it's not clear why they decided to protect their identities, unless it was because the story was false. And these people allege that or Moaz Mustafa has alleged that there are 100 to 150,000 human remains in this one of these mass graves, which is a completely absurd number. About the same number that we saw. There were claims of 150,000 people in the Sednaya prison that was emptied when Damascus fell. And in fact, the documentation showed there were about 3,000 some. I forget the actual number. It might have been 3,900, something like that. So these totally wild numbers. Now, in this mass grave atrocity propaganda that's going around, there's no actual evidence. There's no, Channel 4 goes to the actual site now that they can access, that the Syrian government has collapsed, and it's a free-for-all, and they show a big empty field. There's no evidence even that the dirt has been disturbed. Now, so regarding the alleged mass graves of Assad, there are none. There is one incident from 2012, I believe, that the U.S. government funded New Lines Institute, headed by regime change activist Idris Ahmad, his outlet, in collaboration with The Guardian and another German-funded outlet called Al Jumhuriyeh. They got footage of what looks like a massacre, executions of about 12 people carried out by a few Syrian intelligence figures as revenge apparently for some kind of attack. This one I'm still trying to piece all the exact details together, but that the fact that this was done as after some kind of horrible terrorist attack has been completely omitted. So that's about 12 people, apparently, or maybe it's a few more. It might have been 40, something like that. But that pales in comparison to the 150,000 number that's being bandied about. Now, the real story of mass graves is actually in the northeast of Syria, in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, where ISIS and Al Qaeda, now Jabhat al-Nusra, now HTS, the rulers of Syria, massacred Syrian soldiers, religious minorities like the Ismaili sect, any kind of opposition to the ruler, anybody suspected of being a collaborator. And there are several sites that have actually been documented by the International Commission on Missing Persons and Human Rights Watch, of all organizations. And there's one called the Al-Huta Gorge where, and this is documented, there's actual video of ISIS fighters taking people, executing people. There's videos of them executing people and then taking their bodies and throwing them into the gorge. And according to the International Commission on Missing Persons, there are potentially thousands of human remains in this gorge. And when the residents of the area began to complain to the ISIS authorities that the smell was horrific and that this presented a nuisance to public health, there could be disease, they just poured a bunch of oil into the gorge and set it on fire. Now, Human Rights Watch actually went there. So in 2017, ISIS was defeated by the U.S.-backed Kurdish forces, which branded the Syrian Democratic Forces, and ISIS was ousted. And then who took over in 2019 when President Trump basically removed U.S. forces, greenlighting a Turkish invasion, and basically these Turkish jihadists who the U.S. had said were freedom fighters when they were fighting against the Assad government, they went and slaughtered these Kurdish forces, and now they've been in control of it ever since. And these Turkish forces are called the Syrian National Army, kind of a hilarious name, and they are a proxy of Turkey, just like HTS is. So ever since then, there has been zero political will from any of the human rights groups. Actually, Human Rights Watch did put out statements at the time in 2020 saying these bodies should be exhumed, there should be a full investigation, but that has fallen silent. Human Rights Watch is not saying that anymore. No one in the West or Europe or any of these reporters who are going to look at these open fields and say that these are mass graves of 150,000 people have anything to say about the documented real mass graves in eastern Syria that were carried out by Al Qaeda, which now rules Syria, and ISIS, which was, of course, sponsored chiefly by Turkey, and the Gulf regime. So you can see that there is a clear political agenda to basically distort reality, cover up, ignore documented real mass graves, and try to invent mass graves, stories of mass graves without any evidence. And I'm not saying, hey, you know what? Maybe there are 1,000 or 10,000, or maybe there's even 150,000 bodies in that mass grave, in that field that they're saying is a mass grave. But they haven't presented a shred of evidence. And it's not the onus is on them. People will say to me, well, Dan, how can you be sure? You can't prove there's no mass grave. But how logic works and the rule of law works is if they are the ones making the allegation, not me, and their evidence does not line up. So it doesn't add up. So you just see the incredibly cynical propaganda campaign to paint Bashar al-Assad as some Hitler-like genocidal mass murderer, erase the role of the numerous regimes who were involved in unleashing these terrorist groups that mass murdered throughout the country and are now running the country and terrorizing the population, and as well as the complicity of those foreign powers themselves. And one last thing, the one of the organizations involved in this is called CIJA, I think it's the Commission on International Justice and Accountability, which is basically, we have a really good report at Uncaptured Media, my site, from Kit Clarenberg, who is a great journalist and everyone should follow, who he showed how CIJA, who's involved in, is basically an organization birthed in Europe by NATO state contractors. And their job, what they did was pay huge sums of money to get faked evidence smuggled out of Idlib from Nusra, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS-controlled territory, which a European Commission found to be falsified. And they want to use this fake evidence to prosecute Assad officials, former Syrian government officials. So this is all part of kind of one effort. These mass grave stories, the Syrian prison torture stories, all of this stuff to basically whitewash history and ensure that Syria never regains its sovereignty also.
Yeah, to remind everyone watching that these same forces that Dan is talking about are now the very ones claiming to rule over Syria, that where there is documented evidence of committing these atrocities. And to anyone out there being like, they've reformed, well, then that just shows how sick especially the Western mentality has become, not only in being able to look at and not do very much about genocide in Gaza, but also to normalize these kinds of forces that the U.S. and its various so-called allies are using to conduct dirty wars like that in Syria. Dan, I want to give you the option to stick around if you want. I have a few more guests. I know that it's Christmas Eve, though, so you are also free to go. What would you like to decide?
I'm happy to stick around. I'm of the Jewish faith. I'm just hanging out today, doing my journalism. If actually I can say one more really quick thing that about this whole mass grave story. The other reason, one of the primary objectives, I think, of the mass grave story is to normalize the Gaza genocide. Gaza is the largest mass grave in the world. It is filled with not only those who have been killed, but those who are sentenced to death by Israel, who Israel's trying to starve to death, particularly in the north of Gaza, and who Israel's massacring every day. So to take these kind of allegations, and the Western media is running with these sensationalist headlines about mass graves in Syria for which there's no evidence, now they can just ignore Gaza, the actual mass graves that are being filled with 50 to 100 newly killed civilians on a daily basis. So this is really also to take people's attention away from the real genocide that is being committed by Israel, by the United States right now in Gaza.
Yes, and without further ado, I want to introduce Laith Marouf and Dmitri Lascaris, both of whom do incredible journalist work. Laith Marouf's website, Free Palestine TV, can be found in the video description below, as can Right to Resist, the YouTube channel that Dmitri runs. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining me today on this Christmas Eve.
Good to be with you. And also hearty hello to our friend Dan Cohen.
Yes, it's wonderful to be with all of you today. Well, let's get right into it. How about we start with you, Laith? I've been asking everyone this question. Given all that has happened, I mean, we can look at the entire year of 2024, but even in just the last month, with the collapse and the overthrow of the Syrian government and the various events that occurred around it, from the ceasefire in Lebanon to the ongoing genocide in Gaza, what is the state of the resistance right now in your estimation? How do you see developments unfolding?
Well, obviously, if we talk about a war of liberation, which this is a war of liberation for Palestine, any war of liberation against colonial rule is not a short war. There is no decolonization war that lasts less than 5 years. And the trigger of Al-Aqsa flood is the beginning of this ticking clock that we have. And clearly also from historical record, there is no way to decolonize a nation with less than 2 million martyrs. Between 2 to 6 million martyrs were required to liberate Algeria and similarly to liberate Vietnam. And that doesn't mean 2 million Palestinians are the price for the liberation of Palestine, but 2 million at least people in the region, as happened with the liberation of Vietnam, that included, you know, in those 6 million that perished in that war, that included millions of Laotians and Cambodians that got engulfed in that war of liberation. So anyone that thinks that we are going to liberate Palestine easily, especially that, again, what is special right now about this war in comparison to other decolonization wars is that the whole Zionist empire, what I would call now a Zionist empire, it's not even an American empire anymore, because the official religion of all the Western states is Zionism right now. The whole Zionist empire is engulfed in this war. Vietnam didn't have to fight anybody other than the French and the Americans combined, let's say. And even then, it was a very short period when both the French and the American armies were fighting it. The Algerians had to only fight the French military. In the situation of even Gaza, without even talking about what happened in Lebanon, what happened in Syria, what's happening in Yemen, looking at what happening in Gaza over the last 14 months is that the whole combined might of the Zionist empire was put into effect against the fighters on the ground in Gaza. And that's what should be put into perspective when we want to judge where are we today. So if we're still in the first year and a half, 14, almost 15 months of this war, and at this point still the Israelis and the whole Zionist empire is unable to break the will of the people in Gaza, the Palestinians that are interned in the extermination camp of Gaza. That is, means we are seeing a huge success for the resistance. Look, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising didn't last this long, and it only had to deal with the Nazis. It didn't have to deal with the whole might of white supremacy and the whole might of what we now see as the Zionist empire. The fall of Syria, we can talk about it more. I am Syrian. I'm a Syrian citizen. And I have a lot of history in my family involved in many stages of Syria since its Ottoman rule till today. And we can discuss why this fall of Syria happened and why isn't also not the end of the resistance, why it should have been actually expected that the fall of Syria was going to happen.
Well, Dmitri, I want to bring it to you. You have traveled to the region extensively in your journalistic work, especially in the last year, from Palestine to Lebanon. What have these travels taught you about this current moment, in particular, the state of the resistance that I asked Laith?
First of all, I think what stands out for me is that the balance of resolve, this is my strong impression, is on the side of the resistance. I saw this not only during my 5 trips to South Lebanon and Beirut in the past 2 years. I saw this when I was in Palestine itself, in the Tulkarm and Jenin refugee camps in March of this year. This is a very important factor in any struggle of this nature, particularly in what is, in effect, a war of attrition. The balance of resolve is very important. And I think that the consensus amongst the resistance groups is that this is a definitive battle that they must win no matter what the cost. And I think that they're willing to pay, and they've demonstrated this abundantly, a much higher cost than the Zionist colonists are prepared to pay. One of the things I've been reporting on is how many Israelis have fled Israel during the past 14 months, going to places such as Cyprus, going to places such as Greece, where I maintain a second home, going to other parts of the Mediterranean. They're in Morocco in large numbers. I've seen credible reports of that. Whereas the people of the region who are being decimated, or civilian populations are being decimated by the Zionist entity, are staying put for the most part and are determined to take a stand. And in terms of what's actually happening on the ground, there are reports backed up by video evidence of Hamas and other Palestinian resistance groups in Gaza continuing to inflict casualties on Israel by a variety of means, by attacks with their mortar forces, by attacks by snipers, by attacks on their armored personnel carriers, tanks, D9 bulldozers. They're continuing to put up quite astonishing resistance when you consider that Israel has dropped more munitions on Gaza during the last 14 months than were dropped on London, Dresden, and Hamburg during the Second World War. We see that the Yemeni forces are continuing to penetrate Israeli air defenses. Just absolutely extraordinary when you think of what Yemen has been through. The Saudi-led bombardment of the country, effectively a genocide that was waged against the Yemeni people, led by the Saudis with the full backing of the West. And then there are popular militias in Iraq, which continue in collaboration with the Yemeni forces to launch successful attacks on Israeli military targets. Hezbollah hasn't been defeated. That's very clear. If it had been defeated, Israel would be occupying South Lebanon, if not more than that. But in fact, it withdrew its so-called elite forces, the Golani Brigade, because it had taken a vicious beating at the hands of a resistance group that doesn't have the benefit of air defenses. It doesn't have the benefit of a massive air force. It doesn't have the benefit of a bottomless well of munitions from the country in the world, the United States, which has by far the largest military budget. And the last thing I want to say about the state of the resistance is it's not a subject you can assess without looking at the state of the opponent. Strength is a relative concept. So we can't assess the strength of the resistance without looking at the condition of Israel. Israel is a mess. It's a complete mess. It has been demonstrated that its ability to wage a land war is pathetic, in my opinion. I'm no military expert, but I think that's been demonstrated by its inability to defeat Hamas and Hezbollah. It's been demonstrated that its air defenses are porous against hypersonic missiles. Its economy is in rapid decline. As I indicated, many people, especially those who are most mobile in Israeli society, are leaving in large numbers. The country is a pariah. Its prime minister, I believe, just refused to go to Poland for an important ceremony because he was concerned about being arrested. He has an indictment against him at the ICC. There's a genocide case pending against the state of Israel at the International Court of Justice, which I think it's doomed to lose in the long run. Amnesty International just came out and declared Israel to be committing the crime of genocide, the crime of crimes. This country is in serious trouble. And it's not just me who's saying this. It's not just Laith who's saying this or Dan. You can listen to other people with military expertise, diplomatic expertise, people like Lawrence Wilkerson, people like Alistair Crook, who are saying that Israel is confronting an existential threat, which is largely of its own making, and that it may not be here much longer. And that happens to be my view, despite the setbacks which the resistance has suffered.
Yeah, Dan, I want to bring you in here because earlier you were saying that Israel is mired in internal contradictions. Talk about this because I know you've done journalism work on this too.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dmitri's absolutely right. Everything he described with the losses and the Israeli military has suffered. I think there's, I can say I was actually in Israel, occupied Palestine in August for a week, and I didn't announce it because I was filming a documentary that will be coming out hopefully soon. But one of the things that I noticed is I spoke to so many people who want to leave, who are just like, I'm done with this society. I can't bear being here anymore. And these are not, people who are not Zionists or or people who don't want to stay. It's that they can't bear it anymore. And so, I mean, that's something I can tell you from actually having been there relatively recently. There's something I think even deeper that, and this is the real reason that I think Israel will ultimately collapse. And it's an ideological process, because the whole idea of Zionism, the very definition of Zionism, and I think people really need to understand this in a better way, especially anti-Zionists. If you really want to understand Zionism, you have to be able to define it. And the concept of Zionism is that Judaism is not a religion, it's a nationality. And when the Zionists first came around, they were basically people who said Jews, religious Jews that have existed for thousands of years and want to live separate from the rest of society and reject secularism and just want to stay kind of in their own little world, separate from everyone else, and study Torah and this kind of thing. Zionists were basically Europeans who rejected all of that and said, that's disgusting, that's a horrible way to live. All of the anti-Semites who hate us are actually right, and it's because of them. You can look up statements from Vladimir Jabotinsky, the founder of revisionist Zionism, which is the dominant strain of Zionism today, where he says that the anti-Semites are right about the Jews. This is what the Zionists said. So in order to create this idea of a Jewish nation, to invent it, they had to take Judaism and completely change it into something that doesn't exist. A nation is something that happens in an organic process. It's people who live together. They, for example, share the same language. Okay, so in the United States, basically everyone speaks the common language is English, is Americanized English. For Zionists to create that, they had to create a new language. They took the biblical language of Hebrew and invented a completely new language. And to show how ludicrous the invention was, for example, I can use the word bitachon. In biblical Hebrew, bitachon is like it's like a faith in God, or it's like belief in God. When Zionists created modern Hebrew, they took the word bitachon and changed it to mean security, like homeland security. The minister of defense in Israel is called the minister of bitachon. There are numerous examples like that. Had they just completely emptied all of the religious concepts from Judaism, just turned it into like rank European nationalism. Now, the thing is, they could not, if you are going to say you are a Jewish nation, what does that mean to be a Jew? Because for the original Zionists, and even many of them today, that means they just want to live in Tel Aviv and sip coffee and live like they're in Europe without any Arabs around them, with a bunch of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and they stay over there, or in refugee camps in Lebanon or the West Bank or Jordan, and they stay over there and use the military to attack them when necessary. Okay, that's what some of them do. But the logic of because Judaism is actually a religion, there was a strain that created a concept of religious Zionism that basically took nationalism and said, no, this is actually a religion. Our religion is nationalism. And that's what religious Zionism is. And that is the completely dominant strain in power today. Everyone around Netanyahu, not only Ben Gvir, not only Smotrich, but all of the institutions, the government, the military, the media, all of them are filled at the top with religious Zionists who believe that we have to fully ethnically cleanse all of this land. That's why they want to ethnically cleanse Gaza. That's why Smotrich has his plan for the West, presented his plan for the West Bank, the subjugation plan to ethnically cleanse it, and whatever Palestinians want to stay have to declare loyalty to the state of Israel. So there is no real definition of a Jew in Israel. There's even Supreme Court decisions where they try to come up with that. On the Israeli ID, it does not say you are an Israeli national. It says you are a Jewish national. So if you're a Jewish national, but then can your religion be Christian? Can you be a Christian Jew? It doesn't make any sense. It's completely illogical. And so because there is no unifying concept of what a Jewish national is, then this is something that is bound to fail when it comes under enough pressure, and the United States, stops just keeping it going. And so, whereas in Lebanon or Syria or Palestine, you have people of all kinds of different religions and ethnicities that consider themselves first and foremost Lebanese or Syrian or Palestinian. In Israel, you don't have that. You have a completely fake, invented Jewish nationality that ironically is completely anti-Jewish, is completely against the Jewish religion. So that's why I think fundamentally Israel will collapse.
Well, Laith, let's get you back in. I know you wanted to talk about Syria in light of what everyone has been saying. I've been reflecting on Syria, Laith, because as you said earlier, maybe this should have been expected, and you have an analysis of why it might have been expected. For me, just reflecting back on the last few years alone, even the last year of genocide in Gaza, how mum the Syrian government was, how intense the sanctions were, 90% of Syrians living in absolute poverty. And then thinking about the years of war, the years of dirty war, invasion, and how what it looked to me, Laith, please give me your analysis, but it looked to me like a coup. Like the government had been internally eroded, especially at the military level, to essentially give up the country. What is your analysis? Oh, I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. So obviously it's important to put in context. This is Syria before the dirty war, and Syria after the dirty war, Syria after the stop of hostilities in 2016, and what happened after. And of course, we start with the understanding that Syria has been under sanctions since its foundation, has been under siege by the West since 1942, that Syria lived 8 coups that are organized by the CIA, the French, the Israelis, and the local assets of the West before the coming of the Ba'ath Party into power in 1970. So we're talking about a country also that has the only country in the Arabic world that lived, other than the Palestinians, that have lived so many wars. Every decade since 1942, since its foundation as a state, it had to live a war because of its political positioning on the side of liberation of Palestine. And given this context and the fact that all around it there is all these Gulf oil-rich countries that are vassals of the West, that are spending their money since the 1940s to demoralize Syria, to impoverish Syria, to infiltrate Syria with this money, when it's a small country that doesn't have much resources except to keep its population alive with the proudness of being sovereign and for the liberation of Palestine. All of these things make it clear that the Syria by 2012, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of unipolarity, basically, of the United States destroying everything around Syria and coming for Syria because of its political positioning, it was a miracle, actually, that it survived in 2011, 2012, the initial hordes invasion of Wahhabi death squads from Turkey and Jordan. And in fact, if we think about how Syria survived that moment, it was only because Syria, up until then, was a socialist country that provided free healthcare, free education, and also had subsidized food, goods, subsidized gas and oil prices, and it had a sovereignty and independence in its food and oil and gas needs because of its oil and gas fields. It didn't have much, but it had enough only to maintain its market independence. And it had 7 years of reserves of all of its needs. And because of the dirty war on Syria, that reserve was depleted on the one hand. On the other hand, all of the land that had these major resources, like the gas and oil and the wheat fields of the Northeast, was looted by the United States. And at that point, the state in reality didn't exist because it couldn't anymore provide services. No more healthcare, no more free education beyond the basics, and definitely no more gas and oil and or subsidized much food. And what worsened even things more, of course, was the fact that when the stagnation came into effect, when the Russians forced Syria and Hezbollah to stop their advances in Idlib because Russia wanted to negotiate a deal with the Turks or try to court the Turks out of NATO, into BRICS, into whatever sphere of multipolarity they're envisioning as Russians. And while the hostilities ceased, there was no uplifting of the economic situation. The resources were not returned to Syria, and neither Russia or Iran managed to subsidize the losses of the Syrian state inability to reach its strategic resources under occupation by the Americans and the Turks. And thus, the last 5 years before the collapse of the state were actually the worst days that Syria lived in the last 80 years. The population was so severely impoverished, and the soldiers, their salaries were like $10, $15, $20 a month. That meant the morale within the army that fought the hordes and defeated them started collapsing. And in fact, you know, it was cheaper for a Syrian to go and bribe somebody to pretend that they are serving their services and taking a full-time job than going to serve their time in the Syrian military. Also, the soldiers in those checkpoints that were all around the country to stop the movement of terrorists and explosive cars and suicide cars and what have you, those checkpoints became kind of like shakedown situations where people were, where they're, you know, transporting goods across the country from one side to another, and they're having to pass 7 checkpoints, and they're having to pay basically the salaries of the soldiers with tips on those. This is all was preparing the country for what we saw happen. And, you know, it became even easier than in 2011, when in 2011, the Gulf countries threw all their money at the military of Syria, trying to create defections within the generals. And they managed to have just a few generals defect at that time. But at this moment, it was clear that there was no way Syria can compete with the bribery flow coming out from the outside. And because of Russia's still hopes that it can negotiate with a new Trump coming into power over its territorial gains in Ukraine, and the abandonment of Russia, basically, and I would say even the kidnapping of Assad to Moscow. He was taken out 4 days before the attack on Aleppo. Everybody knows on the news, it's still up there. People can see that he was in Moscow 4 days before the collapse of Aleppo, and then we never heard from him until we were told that he's back in Moscow again somehow. In reality, he was brought to Moscow and he was held hostage and made sure to resign and let the government collapse, while the generals that were working with the Russians in general, most of the time under command of Russian military forces, were told to stand down and saw their way out. The country collapsed because of the failures of both Russia, its still hopes of negotiating with the West, and the failures of the Iranians or the axis of resistance to actually fill in the gap of the non-existent state. A state can only exist if it has resources. The state of Syria since 2011, 2012 ceased to exist other than an army. And when you couldn't feed the army anymore, let alone the people, of course it's going to collapse this way. So nobody should have been surprised at what happened. Now, I would say one last thing is that Syria is not lost, not because the Wahhabi despots are not in control, the Israelis are not in control, the Turks, the Americans are not in control. They're all in control currently, but they're only in control of this imaginary Syria that they built in the media. On the ground, everybody is armed right now. Every little town and city is creating its own militias to protect itself from these head choppers. And the Syrian people will not accept the Wahhabi rule. It's not going to be, nobody's going to accept an Afghanistan or a Saudi Arabia, because this is the cultural hub of the whole Arabic world. Syria has the biggest media industry in terms of music, in terms of TV and film, the most watched, the most consumed music and television and so on. And the first thing that the new Minister of Media, who by the way was Al-Qaeda's chief propagandist in charge of their Al-Amaq website, their propaganda, and also the chief propagandist of ISIS and HTS eventually. He's now the Minister of Information and Media in Syria, appointed by the Jolani. The first decree that he made was ban the music and film and television industry of Syria. Not allow them to film anymore and record. So this is, of course, not going to last for long. This is just momentary what we see.
Dmitri, I wanted to bring you in for any comments on this.
Well, I actually went to Syria once in my life, and it was last year with Laith. I managed to get into Damascus with some difficulty. Laith accompanied me. We spent a day there. I did see with my own eyes this practice of basically paying what we'll refer to generously as tips to the much impoverished Syrian military just to get into the country. I had a visa, but my driver was doling out money with reckless abandon for reasons he's never explained to me. And after, in retrospect, I think it's obvious why. These soldiers are impoverished and it was their only way to survive. But when we got into Damascus, I was greatly impressed by the cultural and religious diversity and the pluralism of the city, the beauty of this city. There's no doubt that it was afflicted with many problems. Laith and I went to the edge of a neighborhood that had been actually occupied by the jihadists, I believe, back in 2015, 2014, a suburb of Damascus. So the country had gone through terrible, terrible suffering. And I agree with Laith's assessment. And perhaps, this is with the benefit of hindsight. But when one looks objectively at what Syria endured, it's not surprising at all that its military collapse. The one point which I take issue with Laith's analysis, and Laith and I had a discussion about this on my program, is what is Russia's role in all of this? I think Laith's interpretation of the events is entirely plausible, which is to say that Russia essentially did a deal trading Syria for its objectives in Ukraine. But I think that requires us to believe that Russia trusted the United States government to keep up its end of the bargain, because now Syria has been at least temporarily delivered into the hands of US-backed and Turkish-backed jihadists and Israel. That's, at least in the near term, an irreversible outcome. In the longer term, it is reversible, but not anytime soon. And are we really convinced that Vladimir Putin would expect that Donald Trump would keep his end of the deal and accede to Russia's demands, territorial and otherwise, in Ukraine? I'm skeptical about that. But having said that, I do think that some kind of a deal was done. And I think, it's going to take us some time to figure out exactly what the contours of that arrangement were. The other thing I want to say about all of this, I think Dan's point is extremely important. There are the internal contradictions, the rise of fanaticism within Israel, the battle between the secular elements of Israeli Jewish society and the messianic elements of Israeli Jewish society, which is, I think, coming to a head. Deep-seated problems, which I think are unresolvable. But I want to come back to something I said back in October and November of this year when we assessed the state of the resistance and where all of this is heading. Israel is a geopolitical pipsqueak. Israel is a very small population. It has very few resources. It does have nukes, but obviously using them comes with enormous risks and costs. Its military, as we've seen, is not nearly what it is advertised to have been. And even Israeli military leaders have admitted throughout the last 14 months that if it wasn't for massive US and other Western government support, Israel would not have been able to carry out the crimes that, I mean, they didn't call them crimes, but obviously they are, the crimes that it has committed relentlessly throughout the region. So what does this all mean? This all means that Israel's power is ultimately dependent upon the power of the United States. And if the United States government, military, and economy lose the ability to project their power into West Asia, Israel's finished. And that's exactly what is happening. The longer-term trend is a transfer of power from the Anglo-American empire to the east, to countries that are actually quite sympathetic with the Palestinian cause, fed up with US hegemony. And as long as we continue down that trajectory, and there's no indication that it's going to change. I mean, if you look at Donald Trump, this is not a man who has any interest in addressing the root problems within the American economy, the American society. Is he going to tackle, the problem of big money in election finance? No, he's a beneficiary of that. Is he going to tackle the problem of eroding infrastructure? No, he's more interested in reducing the taxes of the ultra wealthy, which is only going to exacerbate another huge problem in the United States, which is grotesque inequality. U.S. has a massive debt that's spiraling out of control. The U.S. dollar is becoming less and less important to global trade and the global economy. And that's going to have serious implications for the United States' ability to service its enormous and growing debt. U.S. Society is riven, like Israel, is riven with ideological problems, relating to wokeism, liberalism, and so forth that seem to be unresolvable. There's an epidemic of violence in the United States. Mass shootings on a daily basis. There are more guns than there are people in the United States. This is a deeply, deeply troubled society and economy, and it's going down the toilet. And if it goes down the toilet, Israel is toast. It's as simple as that. And that's exactly where this is all heading.
Dan, I know that you have to depart, so I wanted to ask you if you had any final comments, words before you do.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with Dmitri. I mean, yeah, Israel's a tiny population. Its Jewish population is like 7 million. In it's a tiny minority in a region where all it does is create enemies, and that is not a very good formula for longevity going into the future, and tying itself to only to the United States, where it has basically burned relations with other countries, not only in Europe but with Russia. It's isolating itself all over the problem. All over the world. It's just diplomatically. I mean, the public opinion, all of the sympathy that Israel had, particularly in the West, on October 7th, and we saw these supposedly horrific images of this horrible terrorist attack, and it had all of this kind of propaganda capital, and it's just gone on to burn everything and become basically an international pariah, accused by the ICJ and the ICC of genocide. Netanyahu, he couldn't even go into Poland, which is a NATO member. I mean, that's EU, NATO. That should be, home territory. It says everything. So, I mean, that kind of ties back to what we were discussing earlier about resistance, that, if you look at the long term, things are not looking good for Israel. So that optimism that you were expressing, I share that. And yeah, basically that's it.
Everybody should follow, subscribe, support Dan's Uncaptured Media. You can find that in the video description. Dan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Take care. All right. So, in the last 20 minutes or so, I wanted to, and I can bring it back to you, Laith, look forward into 2025. Right now, the situation in West Asia, I can't summarize it in totality, but briefly, of course, we have the ongoing genocide in Gaza, Israel continuing to conduct its massacres in Gaza and Palestine more broadly. But you also have the resistance fighting fiercely. It hasn't put down arms and put up the white flag after the fall of Syria. You also have even Israel admitting, to Dmitri's point, that it's a pipsqueak. I really like that summary, because even Israeli media are admitting that Iran and even Yemen, these are two forces that they can't seem to figure out, that they are actually quite worried about getting into any kind of war of attrition with these two forces. Hezbollah, of course, there's the ceasefire, Laith, where you reside in Lebanon, but at any moment, Israel is saying they are going to go back in. So in 2025, where do you see things headed? What do you want to highlight when it comes to the overall situation, both within the regional and global context?
I think the month of January is going to be very crucial to set the tone for the whole year. So we have this supposed ceasefire in Lebanon, the date of the end of the 60-day period where the Israelis are supposed to be completely withdrawn from any territory they occupy will fall just a few days before the inauguration of Trump. And of course, as we see, up until today, the Israelis didn't move an inch, and they continue to attack civilian infrastructure, blow up homes, and target civilians and martyr civilians, as we saw today and yesterday and the day before. So what is going to happen with this ceasefire? Are the Israelis going to trigger a war again? Are they going to withdraw? Will the resistance attack the Israelis, Hezbollah specifically, in South Lebanon if they don't move before the end of the 60 days? Those are all up for questions. We don't know the answers yet, but we definitely will know by the day Trump comes into power what will play there. In terms of what's happening in Gaza, the genocide will continue because up until now, clearly the Israelis have the full backing and support of the imperial order in terms of giving them an umbrella of protection in international courts and or international bodies, and of course the non-ending supply of weapons and financing for the failed economy. In terms of Yemen, we're also waiting to see how this plays out. Before I talk about Yemen, I'm going to say the West Bank is also a big story, because over the last 2-3 days, the Palestinian Authority has been invading and besieging Jenin and Jenin camp and using RPGs on Palestinian civilian homes. This is the collaborationist security forces of Mahmoud Abbas, who didn't lift one finger or fire one bullet against the Zionists in the West Bank and inside Gaza for the last 15 months, are now emboldened enough, thinking that in their mind the axis is weaker, and also because they want to show their Zionist masters that they are qualified to rule Gaza as their local henchmen, as their local Vichy regime. And so for the last 2 days, this battle in Jenin now is boiling over into Ramallah. Today there was a huge demonstration in Ramallah where the Palestinian Authority resides and Mahmoud Abbas resides, of the population condemning the security forces and the attacks on Jenin. And this is all happening simultaneously as the colonists in the West Bank are rampaging through the villages around Hebron and around Ramallah, and with nobody stopping them. There's ethnic cleansing campaigns of expulsion of multiple villages that happened, of course, over the last few months, but even more so right now, is intensifying, as it's intensifying in the south of Syria, the territory that the Israelis occupied. Over 100,000 Syrians have been now expelled from the 40 somewhat villages that the Israelis occupied in the south of Syria. And finally, I would say we have the front in Yemen. And as we see, the whole naval power of the West is facing off with Yemen, as well as the Israeli air forces, to try to subdue them. But the Yemenis have succeeded in chasing away 3 different aircraft carrier groups. The last of them, as we saw 2 days ago, the Yemenis shot down an F-18 and most probably hit the aircraft carrier group of that withdrew. And now the French are bringing their own aircraft carrier group to fill in the gap, because the Americans had now 3 different aircraft carrier groups that are limping back to port. So all of these are open to question. We don't know. And this is all timed with the coming of Trump. Are the different local actors going to try to inflame things before Trump comes in, or are they going to try to slow them down for Trump? Those are all questions we can't answer. And then the whole year is going to be set by the tone of January.
Dmitri, same question to you.
Let me begin by acknowledging the difficulty of predicting in this environment what's going to happen in 2025. We're in truly uncharted territory. The situation is extremely volatile for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that Donald Trump is all over the map. He's talking about buying Canada and seizing the Panama Canal. And one day he seems to want to make peace with Russia. And then at another time, his people like Sebastian Gorka are calling Putin a thug. And members of his incoming administration are saying that they're going to continue arming Ukraine. So it's really hard to predict what is going to transpire. That being said, I think I'm going to borrow a word that Laith employed, emboldened. He used it in the context of the Palestinian Authority. I think that applies, and I'm sure Laith would agree, equally to the government of the Zionist entity itself. As a result of the election of Trump, and as a result of the fall of Assad, and as a result of the ceasefire to which Hezbollah acceded in South Lebanon, the Netanyahu regime undoubtedly feels emboldened. And now, after they engaged in this bombing rampage in Syria after the fall of Assad, there's open discussion in the Israeli military and intelligence circles and the corporate media in Israel about the fact that Syria has become a much more liberal environment within which the Israeli Air Force can operate for purposes of attacking Iran. And you also are hearing voices in the genocidal regime saying, we really shouldn't be focused on Yemen because, after all, it's Iran which is providing the weaponry and the funding to Ansar Allah. So let's just attack Iran or focus our efforts there. And, you are what your record says you are. And the record of Donald Trump is that he is willing to give the Israel lobby whatever it asks for. Recognize, the Golan Heights is Israeli territory, even though it's a flagrant violation of international law that Israel annexed it. No problem, said Donald Trump. Let's move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. No problem. Let's assassinate the top general of Iran, Qasem Soleimani, even if it might provoke a war with Iran. No problem. So based on history and what we're hearing coming out of Israel, I think we're headed towards a full-blown war with Iran. Nobody has ultimately addressed the problem that Iran has the capacity to penetrate Israel's air defenses with hypersonic missiles, and it has a large number of them. That problem remains, and it will ultimately rear its ugly head if Israel does launch a full-blown attack on Iran. And, the elephant in the room, of course, is that Iran might finally bite the bullet and say, really, the only way to protect ourselves is develop a nuke. They have the capacity to do it. No, and again, this is one of the many gifts or poisoned chalices that Trump handed Israel. He destroyed the Obama-era nuclear deal with Iran, which Iran was respecting. And as a result of that, Iran engaged in greater levels of enrichment of nuclear material. And undoubtedly, we've seen their missile technology. They can develop a platform for delivering a nuclear weapon. And if they do that, at that point, that's a game changer. It will change the entire balance of power in the Middle East and be a strategic disaster for both Israel and the United States. And that's something that might very well happen. So what I see 2025, Danny, and I very much hope I'm wrong, but I think we're likely to see escalation to the ultimate and direct conflict between Iran and its allies on the one hand and Israel and the United States on the other.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's definitely possible, because this is where it's all been heading, right? Like, because I look at the stretch of 2024 in the historic seismic waves that we've seen just in this year alone, the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, Israel and Iran trading strikes I don't remember. I can't really recall a time in history where that has occurred to this level. And then, of course, the genocide in Gaza, which is right now, there is no end in sight. All ceasefire discussions are pretty much a joke when it comes to actually dealing something on the ground. And of course, we had what happened in Lebanon, where you reside, Laith, the absolute genocidal terror that Israel enacted on the Lebanese people, which Israel is constantly threatening on continuing again. So how do you see that historically? Maybe final comments for both of you. Historically, where this year has brought us as we go into 2025?
Yeah, I think most people, when they look at what was happening here and in the broader international scene, they thought that Trump is going to come in to calm down the situation with Russia and raise it with China. But in reality, Trump is coming back to the original plan after the collapse of the Soviet Union. At the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States wanted to recapture any republics that escaped colonialism during the Third World movement and decolonization movement in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And they were going ahead with this plan. And part of that plan, in the end of that plan, the top crescendo of that plan, was taking down the axis of resistance, starting with the war on Lebanon in 2006, and then eventually the war on Syria. And unfortunately, while the US was embroiled for those 30 years in wars, mainly in the Arabic world, and this is a note for anybody that wants to belittle the Arabic people and speak down to them. We've heard a few people do that since the fall of the government of Bashar al-Assad. The Arabic people have given more blood in the anti-colonial, decolonization, anti-imperialist struggle than any other nation on this planet, and have faced off alone for the last 30 years practically the Western hordes, unlike much of the rest of the planet. But anyways, during this 30-year embroilment that the West had in the Arabic world, and because of the stubbornness of the Arabic people not giving up at huge costs, China managed to lift itself to become the #1 economy in the world, while the US was not fighting it. And Russia recovered from the collapse of the Soviet Union and rebuilt its economic independence and its military prowess. And so Trump now realizes that it was a mistake what the Democrats did by opening the war in Ukraine before finishing up the uppity Arabs and the uppity Muslims. And now he's going to concentrate on that. It's not going to be an attack on China or Taiwan. He's going to come in to prove that and clear the whole table for America to have the final confrontation with China and Russia. And I think it's not going to go the way that the West wants it. And a great example is the last 30 years of blunders in the region and inability to break the will of the Arabic and Muslim people for the last 100 years.
Yeah. Well, Dmitri, same question to you.
I think we'll remember 2024 as the year in which the Western propaganda system collapsed and was completely discredited. The stark and undeniable disparity between, on the one hand, the rhetoric that Western governments employ with respect to arming and funding Ukraine, and on the other hand, their unlimited support for the rabid Zionist dog. This is not something you can paper over with embellishments and euphemisms. It's become obvious to the entire world that Western elites have absolutely no regard for international law, democracy, sovereignty, or just the most basic sense of human decency. And I don't think that this is a blow from which the Western propaganda system will recover. Another mythology that has been much cultivated by the Western propaganda system over decades is the military superiority of the West and its proxies, and the extraordinary capacity of military technologies that have been developed at immense cost to Western governments and societies over the past several decades. That too has been exploded. The idea that we are democracies, the idea that we have freedom of speech in the West. Maybe we did once, but we certainly don't anymore. As those of us in the alternative media like yourself, Danny, we have to confront challenges every day as truth tellers that the disseminators of Western propaganda don't have to overcome in our attempts to get our message out. So there's just an entire range of lies that have been told to us our entire lives, which have been completely and utterly discredited. And I don't think there's any going back from that. I don't think that the Western propaganda system can rehabilitate itself at this stage. It's just flailing around, throwing out one ridiculous lie after the other. It's become almost a comedy, some of the propaganda we're seeing coming out of the West. And, polls reflect the fact that more and more people distrust the legacy media and will never listen to it again. They have no interest in listening to it again. And whatever efforts are made by Western elites to silence those of us who are committed to telling the truth, ultimately they will fail. And that is going to have catastrophic consequences for Western elites in the Anglo-American empire. So that's what I'll remember 2024 for. And hopefully that prediction will come out true, and my prediction about a broader war in the Middle East will turn out to be wrong. But in any event, I remain, as I hope I've managed to communicate during this conversation, very, very optimistic about the future of the non-Western world. Not so much about the Western world, but I think in the longer run, we're going to see a transfer of power to countries that have been oppressed, silenced, exploited, brutalized for far too long. And that's going to be ultimately result in the betterment of our world and a kinder, gentler, more democratic society for all of human beings.
Well, gentlemen, it was great for you to both join me today. Is there anything you'd like to say in closing? As you depart here, I have both of your links, Free Palestine TV and Right to Resist, your YouTube channel, Dmitri. But any final thoughts, anything you want to say on this Christmas Eve in the Western world, at least?
Well, first off, I would say Merry Christmas to all our brothers and sisters in Syria, in Palestine, in Lebanon, and in the world who are celebrate on the Western calendar, not the Orthodox. Our Orthodox brothers and sisters will say Merry Christmas in January to them. And at the same time, I would want to point out that Free Palestine TV is doing live and reporting from the ground in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Jordan. And we have been doing also producing programming in Syria. We were hiring and employing 4 youth in Syria that were doing the translation and production of all the operation videos, the military operation videos that are coming out from the Axis of Resistance over the last year. Our studios were raided by the HTS, and we don't know if it's HTS, but it's just gangs and militias that were running around in the neighborhoods of Syria, and our equipment were looted. It would be amazing if the viewers can go to the website freepalestine.video, donate, so we can rebuild the studios and continue employing these youth. We're trying to right now bring live programming from the ground in Syria and trying to figure out ways how we can at least give privacy and protection to those who are producing it, so they don't end up as victims of the head choppers right now in charge of the country. But Merry Christmas to all, and Happy Holidays for everybody else.
How about you, Dmitri?
Laith touched upon the fact that there have been some prominent commentators from the English-speaking anti-imperialist camp who have sounded the death knell for the Palestinian cause. I'm not going to name them now because you can go on my Twitter feed and see conversations happening there. But at the end of the day, I continue to respect these people. I think they have good intentions, but I strongly urge all those who have listened to our conversation today not to succumb to defeatism. We have the power, and I say this with 100% conviction and belief based on everything I've experienced in my life. We have the power to alter our government's policies if we are determined enough, resilient enough, and united enough. And we have an obligation to do that, precisely because our comrades in the Arab world have spilled so much blood, have sacrificed so much. We have no business even talking about their defeat before we have exhausted ourselves every single tool at our disposal to change our government's support for these depraved policies in West Asia and elsewhere. And we've not done that. There's a lot more we can do. And I stand ready, and I know you both do, to contribute to the final victory for justice in this world. In the interim, I wish you all a wonderful holiday season and love and peace and a brighter 2025, let's hope.
Great. Well, thank you, gentlemen. I'll definitely be in touch. I hope you have a good rest of your evening, Laith, and rest of your day, Dmitri. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
So I'm just going to say a few words to the audience, of course, before I depart myself very quickly. However, as we've been going for a while. First, I just want to give a huge thanks of support to all of you viewers who took your Christmas Eve, if you are in fact celebrating that, to view this stream, to be here to discuss these important topics, these critical subjects, these developments which are shaping the world around us. It is truly humbling. This whole year, I will be back before the new year, but this entire year has been a humbling experience in terms of watching this channel grow, watching the audience grow, and watching the success of this channel be carried by the weight of the world developments around us. It is not always easy, in fact, mentally to do this kind of work. It is not easy to stay with it, to put in the amount of work it takes to make this channel happen. But I do it because of the weight of the situation we find ourselves in globally, which is directly related, of course, if you're in the US or the West, to how things are going domestically. And of course, the entire world is touched by the crisis and chaos of the US-led empire. It has been a struggle at times, and even at this moment, there are many struggles. The fall of Syria hit me very hard, but I refused to back down from the overall position that, in fact, the multipolar world is winning, the resistance is winning. And I have a Substack article coming out soon, December 24th, talking about why we should not be celebrating or praising the U.S. empire for a victory in Syria, when in fact this victory could very well blow back right in its face. And I do believe that is what is going to happen, because I have a litany of history that we can discuss more at length some other time, from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. We can go, Syria. I said Syria because Syria is already blown back in so many ways, and it's about to get worse. Libya, Ukraine. We can go on and on and on about U.S. foreign policy supposed victories ending up into a strategic defeat in the long term. That is what is happening. The U.S. capitalist economy will continue to shrink. U.S. military prowess and influence will continue to shrink, and the multipolar world will strengthen. But the challenges, the hurdles, they will be there with us. They will confront us. They will pop up. We are not facing a dead animal. We are facing one that is dying. A dying animal indeed can strike back. It can scratch. It can claw. It can create a violent situation. And especially when that violent animal has more strength, more resources at its disposal than we do. But that is what makes the struggle for a multipolar world so beautiful at the moment, because while there is so much devastation and chaos, that is not victory for the empire, because it itself is facing a declining trajectory. The facts say this, everyone. I am not pulling this out of my behind. The US economy is much smaller than it was when it became a superpower empire after World War II. US foreign policy is much less unsuccessful than it was, especially if we trace it back to the end of the Vietnam invasion. If we just trace those 50 plus years, we see a litany of horrors that end up, while looking like temporary victories of regime change, for example, end up just creating instability and chaos. And the United States having some benefit to this, but oftentimes having to watch as regional forces, as as countries in the multipolar world strengthen because of it. That is where resistance comes from. That is where the struggle for independence, for sovereignty, for self-determination, or empire comes from. It comes from the very weight of the oppression, exploitation, and endless war. That is a contradiction that is not going to go away, and it will continue to feed the strength of the resistance, even as we find setbacks and defeats on a tactical, momentary, and event-based level. So do not despair as we enter what, for most people in the collective West, is a time of despair. I hate to say it. I wish everyone a happy holidays, of course, but let's be quite honest. We know that most people actually find this period of time, not least because of the weather, but also because of history, of how difficult life can be in the collective West, to be a very difficult time. So do not despair over what is going on in the world situation to the point where you are now paralyzed, where you are now pushing the very negativity, the very contradictory pro-empire positions that the empire definitely wants you to take part in. No, this is a time for resolve, discipline, and resilience. But really, what is a time for is to get back to the objectivity of the situation, to look at things with a clear vision, to look at setbacks, defeats, victories as actually being tied together, that there is no linear path toward a multipolar world, but there's only a forward motion path, which has many zigzags, many obstacles, many redirections, and barriers all along the way. But those barriers do not stop this movement. They do not stop the overall trajectory of the world. We are not going to see in our lifetime the destruction of multipolarity, because unipolarity in the US empire is what is in a slow motion collapse. That means Israel is also in a slow motion collapse that at any point could become a lot faster. That means the entire collective West is in slow motion collapse that at any point could become a lot faster, because the inherent contradiction of an empire based on this massive exploitation of the common person, of the ordinary worker, cannot stand forever. No social system ever has, and no social system ever will, at least until we get to the point where we have eradicated these social relationships and have built new ones that are that are connected to and breathe vitality into the needs of the human race. But without further ado, everybody, this is Christmas Eve in the Western world. So go to the video description and be sure to go to Free Palestine TV and donate. Subscribe to Uncaptured Media. Be sure to support media that is covering this world. If you want to support this channel, that is also an incredible gift, and I appreciate all of you for doing so. Become a YouTube member. Send a super thanks, super chat. Go to the video description, subscribe for Patreon, Substack, or whatever else you want to give through. All of it is very much appreciated, because I am truly appreciative of this community. I am going to now review the super chats really quickly. Thank you, Sean, for your contributions. Sam says, how much longer people are going to pretend HTS is for the resistance when they say nothing about the Israeli invasion? Yeah, there's the pretend is so pathetic. There is no pretend here. Let's be honest, everyone. It is just utter fakery. this is just what you call a whitewashing in the extreme. And Sam, thanks so much for your thoughts on that. Respect the resistance. Biggest mistake is that this nightmare cannot happen to us. In many respects, it does. I don't know if you're in the United States, Valentina, but this is happening to us. I believe when we look at the United States rests upon the same foundations as Israel. It's just a lot older and has had hundreds of years, over 200 years, to establish itself and became a superpower. Israel will never be that. I want to just say this very clearly to everyone who has jumped on the Turkey-Israeli bandwagon. Look how strong they are in Syria. Stop it. Stop the nonsense. Turkey is, well, all respect to the people of Turkey. I've been there back in the day when I was a young college student. It has wonderful people. It is amazing history, incredible place, beautiful. The government, the system there, it is a complete lackey of U.S. empire. Now, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have independent bone in its body, because it does. It is playing off Russia. It is trying to establish balanced relations. True. It even was flirting with BRICS, but I would say that that is absolutely bye-bye now. But I just want to stress that training, funding, arming proxies like these HTS, head choppers, these kind of people, this is not how empires in the modern era can be established. That is not going to bring some kind of stable imperial presence, neo-Ottoman presence to West Asia, which, mind you, would be a nightmare anyway. That is not a social system you want to see revived, because it means every national liberation movement, every sovereign country in that region needs to go, including Iran. That is a disaster for the region. But it's not going to happen using head choppers that killed people like Serena Shim and others. He's just documenting the situation. It is not going to bring about some kind of Turkish empire, Turkey-led empire in the region. No. First of all, do you want to know why that's not going to happen? Because the United States allows Turkey, just like it allows Israel, to do what it does. If the United States doesn't want it to happen, it's not going to happen. And now you might say, Danny, that's putting, you just said U.S. is in decline. You just said that the United States doesn't have the same power that it once had. Yes, but all of its efforts to maintain its hegemony are on the real adversaries, the multipolar world. Turkey. If Turkey gets out of order, if Turkey crosses a line and starts to act like it is the chest thumper, it is the head honcho, it is the big dog in the Middle East, game over for Turkey. The United States will do anything. The United States has already tried to overthrow Erdogan in the past. The United States will just make that happen. And it will make that happen. That is something the United States can still do. Do you see what just happened in Syria? The United States spent years trying to overthrow the government, and it finally was able to create the conditions where it happened. I'm not going to say the United States actually did it 100% this time, but since 2011, everything that happened since then created the conditions for 2024 Syria's demise. Turkey, it will be a lot easier. Why? Because it's not so sovereign. It is easily corruptible. And look at Turkey's behavior, Erdogan's behavior, more than willing to capitulate to the United States and negotiate in a weaker and more inferior place. So stop it with the Turkey is going to be some kind of driving force. Maybe it will be in Syria for a time, but the United States empire, one thing it still can do in its decline, like I said, claw and scratch. It will claw and scratch to maintain itself as the positional leader of dominance in West Asia. It will want to focus all of its energies on Iran and the resistance axis. It will not tolerate a Turkey that is trying to nudge the United States out. That will be over for Turkey. So just get it out here. The same thing with Israel. If Israel ever wanted to nudge the United States out and say, hey, Greater Israel is going to just be Greater Israel, dude, get out, the United States would say Greater Israel ain't happening, and it wouldn't happen. I think people overestimate the power of Israel. They overestimate the power of Turkey. They underestimate U.S. power projection as a key component to keeping the United States' declining empire on a foothold for as long as possible. It is not going to allow these two useful forces for it to become unuseful and to nudge it out. That is not, we have ended the era in Western civilization, quote unquote, Western empire, where empires compete with each other. That's over. That ended in World War II. There is no more of that. Any force that builds itself up as a competitor to the United States will be made into a proxy of the United States as soon as possible. So Turkey can do what it does now, can get the green light, maybe it will, to slaughter the Kurds, to do whatever it wants in Syria for a time. But the minute the United States sees that as a problem for U.S. power projection in West Asia is the minute that Turkey's imperial dreams end up remaining just that. I just want to say that because I just can't stand people's misunderstanding of the balance of forces in the world. The world order is U.S. empire, unipolarity versus the multipolar world. Turkey has to make a choice within that as a subordinate to the leading forces in this role. It just so happens that Turkey does have a strong military, but who helped make that happen? The United States helped make that happen. Come on. The United States has had a presence in Turkey for how long? We have to understand that Turkey is not some kind of 100% sovereign entity here. It is working on behalf in an allegiance to an empire that already exists. Its own dreams, they're only able to be accomplished so long as the United States lets it happen. And people say that Israel controls the United States. Look, Israel, this is what can happen when you let an entity that is wholly dependent on you become too important. Israel has so much leverage on the United States, which makes it look like it controls the United States. But if the ruling elite the next day said, hey, what Israel is doing is not useful to us, it wouldn't allow it to happen. That's just the truth. So anyone who says, oh, this is against U.S. interests, for who? Whose interests? Not the elite. I'm sorry. Gaza genocide? You may think it's against the elite's interests. It might be in the long term. In the short term, they see it as, hey, got to get rid of Hamas, got to get rid of the resistance. We can look at any question when it comes to Israel's march toward regional war. Hey, the United States doesn't want to fight that. Let Israel weaken Iran. Let them weaken the resistance forces. You just have to look at a more basic level. I know people think, oh, look at what's happening inside the U.S. government. Yeah, but guess what? Those politicians are getting paid. You have to understand that the minute that Israel becomes inconvenient is the minute that Israel will have to listen to the United States. That is just the fact of the matter. It just happens to be that the U.S.'s declining trajectory and position in West Asia means that Israel is just that much more important. Once Israel lacks that importance, once Israel lacks the capacity to serve U.S. interests, then its leverage will diminish. They'll bow to Netanyahu 100 million times as long as they get what they want. Don't underestimate it. Look. The U.S. empire is in crisis. It is weaker than ever before, but do not overestimate Israel as an entity. I think it is a bit insulting to the reality on the ground, both in West Asia and just globally. Israel's this greater Israel project. You know how long that's going to take to come about? Probably never. And it'll take years upon years upon years. Syria has been a temporary gain in that. But the United States, what would happen to that if the United States just said stop? Or just said, well, we're actually not going to give weapons. But they never do. Why? Because those weapons are profitable to the weapons manufacturers, to the military-industrial complex. It's profitable for the United States. It is beneficial to the United States. The ruling elite. Look at it like this, and you won't be so confused about why the United States allows Israel to do what it's doing. It's not because it's pulling strings. It's because this is a single animal, and Israel is that nice attack dog that has been given too much leverage. So now, you ever seen the dog owner on a leash? You ever seen that? With a dog, they're walking the dog. They don't know, they can't control the dog. The dog has been mistreated. The dog, whatever has happened to the dog, neglected. Here, or the opposite in dog training world, you smother the dog, you give it everything it wants, you placate it constantly. You don't do anything to train it to be a good, loyal companion. Well, the dog's going to make dog decisions, wild decisions in a human world. Israel is able to assert leverage over its paymaster because it has been a very loose leash, and it is a leash that won't tighten until Israel is no longer beneficial to the United States. But guess what? A lot of that will depend on us. A lot of that will depend on us and how we in the collective West, and the sirens I think are appropriate, actually stop this madness. The resistance will do the resistance's job. Israel will not be able to succeed in any of its objectives because it has to fight basically the people of the region in order to get there. That's not going to succeed in the long term. So it really is up to us to stop it. If we didn't want to see the Syrian government fell, it was up to us to stop that 2011. That's what I was trying to do from 2012, 13 onward. And we failed. We failed as an anti-war, pro-peace, pro-self-determination, pro-multipolarity, whatever we want to call ourselves, anti-imperialist movement. We didn't get the job done. So that's where the onus rests from here on out. I don't think I finished this. Sorry. Thank you so much. Who holds more influence in Iran, Ayatollah or the president? Sorry, Nazia, for not getting to that. But we will have Professor Marandi on again to discuss that, because I actually don't really know. I think in some matters it's probably the supreme leader. In some matters it's probably the president. Sparky, does Erdogan need to flood Syria with Turkish army before the U.S. Israel figure out how to stop them? It may be the only chance for Syria to pull back from being the next Libya. Interesting. That's what I'm saying, though. There's going to have to be a real gambit here on the part of the United States. They're going to have to figure out how they manage the contradictions of a place like Syria. I don't think they're going to be able to maintain control. And I believe that Syria could very well end up like Afghanistan with different conditions. So rather, the U.S. is occupying Syria to a degree, stealing oil, but it's not a full-scale occupation of the entire country, dictating its entire political system. It is more covert than that. It is more so-called soft power than that, but less military forces on the ground. But the result could be very well the same. The forces that have been unleashed, the way these forces behave, it's like a Mujahideen situation in Afghanistan, except with many different iterations, and they'll do what they do. And they could very well see the ouster of all these forces, Israel notwithstanding, because it seems like these forces are in a love fest with Israel. So with all that said, thanks, Sparky. Thank you, Black Bach. And Sparky, you sent a couple more. Thank you. All right, everybody. I just want to say many thanks again. I am going to depart here after this mega stream. I'll be back probably on the 30th. I believe Scott Ritter will be coming back on the program, but I will keep you all updated on that. Everybody, I am in humble appreciation of all of your support over this past year. Thank you so much. I hope you all have a great holiday. Be sure to go to the video description to support independent media covering this region, West Asia, the geopolitical developments, as well as the crisis, humanitarian crisis happening there, the genocide, etc. There's so many good resources. I was only able to pull a few. I was going to try to have a show, massive show of many more guests, but it's the holiday, so many people weren't available. They will be on the show eventually, though. So go to the video description. You can find all those links. Support me on Patreon, Substack, wherever. Before you go, be sure to hit that like button if you haven't already. All right, because that will help boost the stream once it's all gone. Leave a comment. All of that is very important because this is the holiday period and things can get a little slow during this time. So with all that said, everybody, appreciate all of you. Thank you so much. I will see you again very soon after the holiday, before the new year. Take care and bye-bye.